Hello, dear viewers. Support me by subscribing to my channel and share my video if you like it. And also, make sure you comment your thoughts. Now let's start the video. They flew south towards Winterfell, and the closer they got to the keep itself, the more of the battlefield below she could see. Dany found herself looking down nervously at the mass of dead that was beneath them. When she saw the sheer number of her people on horseback, she smiled. The knowledge that so many had survived filling her with the hope that they'd been far luckier than she'd feared. She almost begged Drogon to fly faster to the keep when she began to picture the faces of those closest to her, and her wish to see them all in the flesh began to overwhelm her. Rosier landed first, and then Drogon did so beside him. Dany, watching as Aegon removed Bran's body from her son's back and laid it surprisingly gently on the ground. Her eyes were soon drawn to the horses that rode their way, and she began to wonder if Aegon saw them too, and if so, was he performing a mummery? Given what happened when they reached them, it soon became clear he was dead. Dany saw some of the northern lords in Arya start to be amongst them, and her husband's intent was now clear to her. "Jon," Arya said, jumping from her horse and running to him. "I know you'd make it, little sister, you of all people," Aegon said, hugging Arya tightly. "Is that... Oh gods, Bran," Arya said, and Danesy's heart went out to the young girl as she began to cry out, even despite her own feelings for the boy. His sister deserved a better brother to mourn. He helped, he helped, but in the end, Aegon said, and Dany wondered if any of the others could tell how insincere he was being over the death of his brother, or did his true sympathy for his little sister cover it up. "My queen," Sarah said, and Dany smiled as she embraced her bear, smiling even more when she saw Corno and Grey Worm both behind him. "Your Grace," she heard Ser Jaime Lannister say, and she turned to see him speaking to Aegon. "We should ride for the keep. I'll take my brother," Aegon said, and Dany looked to him and saw him nod as Kierno handed her the reins of her horse. Entering Winterfell, she welcomed the cheers that rang out, her Dothraki loudest of all. Though the Northmen weren't too far behind, the Unsullied welcome was more stoic, a simple tapping of their spears to the ground. When they saw her and when people began to chant loudly for the king and queen, she finally felt what was a true welcome in this place. Almost all the northern lords gave her warm smiles, and the soldiers' own were even warmer. Daenerys dismounting her horse and walking over to stand by her husband's side. She looked at Aegon, who gave her the nod and allowed her to be the one to speak, something she was most grateful for. "The Night King is fallen, his evil ended at my husband's hands. The King of the North and South, proving himself to be the true king." Dany said to loud cheers, "The King of the North, the King of the North, King Jon." She found that she enjoyed the praise her husband received. It was well-deserved, and she could see in the eyes of those assembled that their praise was not for him alone. The words that were shouted out not more than a moment later showing just how true that was. "The Dragon Queen," Tormund shouted out loudly, and Dany noticed he carried a horn filled with something in his hand. "Hail Queen Daenerys! Hail to the Dragon Queen!" Dany waited until the chants and cheers began to subside and then nodded to Aegon, bidding him say the rest. They were a partnership, a queen and a king untied as one. And the realm should know that she felt. "Today we mourn those who lost. We say our goodbyes to friends, family, and to loved ones, to heroes one and all." Aegon said loudly, "Tonight, though, we drink and feast to our victory, not just mine nor my queen's, but our victory. Each of us here fought against an army that we had no right to beat. We fought and we won, all of us. Tonight we drink and feast, and know that your king and queen do so in your name, and that it will be our greatest honor to do so with each of you. You, the heroes who brought the dawn," Aegon said to even louder cheers. She watched him pick his brother up and carry him to the crypts. Arya walking beside him, and Ser Jaime a little way behind. Ser Jorah bid her follow, and as they walked, he told her of the losses they'd suffered. Dany, almost in disbelief they'd been so low. "Your Grace staying with us kept it so. Having you and Drogon fight never allowed them to overrun us," Ser Jorah said. "Aegon killed the Night King, Ser Jorah," she said, feeling that he wasn't giving her husband his due and finding that was not his intent. "Aye, he did. You did so together, my queen. A king and queen who both fought for their people, and without you both we'd have not seen the morn." "Tenir," Jorah said. "Then we shall celebrate that fact tonight. We'll drink and break bread. and mayhap even share a dance or two. We'll forget everything else for tonight at least, she said with a smile. And on the morrow? Targaryen asked. We make plans for the last war, Targaryen, she said determinedly, as they walked to her room. Riverlands 303 AC to 305 AC. Edmure Tully. Almost 3 years he'd rotted alone in a cell inside the twins, only allowed out of it when Jaime Lannister had used him to give up his uncle and his family home. The threats of what he would do to his child enough to have him betray his kin and his men. He thought he'd die from the shame of it, or that, once they'd squeezed the last bit of use from him, then Walder Frey would finally make good on his promise. The Lord of the Crossing had come to see him and mock him more than once while he was a prisoner, bringing him news of his son in order to show him just how unneeded he was. Edmure forced to watch him take pleasure in telling him that his time was almost done. His uncle's resistance stalled his fate, temporarily, at least, or so he had thought. After he'd been brought back to the twins, Jaime Lannister of all people had granted him a kindness and allowed him to see his son. Edmure smiling as he looked into the deep blue eyes of young Brandon. They'd placed him back in his cell and he'd waited for the end to come, only for his wife to come to him instead. Rosalie told him what had happened, and Edmure soon found himself looking around the twins at the bodies of the men who'd tormented and belittled him for years. He'd wished for nothing more than to ride and take back his home, but he was in no condition to do anything of the sort. His lack of food and being able to move freely left him far too weak to leave for some time. So he'd helped his wife take control of the twins themselves, had built his strength back up, and found that he wasn't the only prisoner that the Fruits still had in their dungeons. Mark, he said, opening the door to the cell. Begone, spirit, begone, and leave me to my doom. A tried and almost broken voice called out. Mark, it's me. It's Edmure, truly, he said, reaching out and touching the shoulders of his closest friend, and finding him shrinking away from him. Edmure? Mark said after a few moments. Aye, come, let's get you washed and fed. He had found both Lemond, Goodbrook, and Carl Vance to be alive too. Both men were almost too thin and emaciated to move, and he knew it would take time for them to recover, if they ever truly would. To his horror, he found that not one of the Northmen had survived and been kept as prisoners. The Freys, or perhaps the Boltons, who'd played their own role in things, had seen to that. As the weeks turned into moons, he spent as much time training and building his strength back up in the yard as he did with his wife and son. Edmure, finding that it took time for the three of them to get to know each other and to be comfortable being close. Rosier, it turned out, was made of far sterner stuff than first impressions had led him to assume, though truth be told, it was her looks and not her strength of will that he'd cared about then. Over time, though, it had become the latter, and soon enough they were making plans to take back his home and the Riverlands themselves. Ser Mark and Ser Lemond had both grown strong enough to fight, and though Ser Carl had not, it was only a matter of time. We need to send word to Seaguard. Lemond, can you ride and speak to the Molisters? He asked, and Lemond nodded. What about the Ravens? Mark asked. I don't know who we can trust, but word will spread soon enough of our survival, so it's for the best that we make ready, he said. And Mark nodded. It took him almost a year and a half to retake the Riverlands and River Run, and there were still pockets of resistance that were loyal to the crown. When he heard of events in the north, he'd taken a moment to think of calling for their aid, but they'd not come to rescue him when he'd needed them. Despite Rosen's words that it was a wolf who'd come to the twins and the words the young girl had apparently spoken, Edmure bristled that they'd left him and the others to rot in the cells if it was truly the Starks who'd done so. Later, when he heard that Jon Snow had been named king, he considered it even more. He had, though, in the end, decided he needed to set his own land straight and to prove himself worthy to any who may ever grow doubts and seek to challenge his rule. When he heard of the Dragon Queen, it caused its own issues. His father had fought against her own, and yet she fought, or would soon fight, against the Lannisters, and Edmure wondered if an alliance was possible, some of his lords even suggesting that he travel to Dragonstone to see her. But for now, he ignored their advice and suggestions. His wife was carrying their second babe, and the time was drawing close for the birth, Edmure having no wish to miss this one as he had Bryndon's. Should we send someone else, my lord? His steward asked as they sat in the great hall in Riverrun. No, we wait. No doubt they'll come to us before too long, he said, and Utherides nodded his agreement. As you command, my lord, Utherides said as a servant came running into the great hall. The babe, my lord. The Maester says the babe is coming, the servant shouted out. He ran from the room into his wife's chambers, almost bursting inside when he heard the pained screams, the guards quickly moving out of his way to let him enter. Vaemon, however, did not, and soon enough he was sitting in the outer chambers as the sounds tailed off and he finally heard the soft cry of a babe. Edmure looked to the door and saw it open before Vaemon stepped out to look him in the eye. "You have a daughter, my lord," Brybeen said, and Edmure smiled before taking on a worried look. "My wife?" he asked. "As well, you may see them both if you wish. Congratulations, my lord," Vaemon said, and Edmure nodded and then walked into the room. His wife lay in the bed, her face most pale, but she looked healthy and happy, and in her arms she held a small bundle. Edmure moved over and carefully sat down on the bed beside her, his fingers brushing her hair from her face as his eyes focused on the babe in her arms. The telltale signs of red hair were already clear on her head, and her sparkling blue eyes were open and wide. "Cat," he said softly, as he placed his hand on the babe's face and looked to his wife. "You are well?" "Most well, my love," Rosen said. Over the next few days, Rosine recovered her strength and her color, and news began to arrive about the Dragon Queen over the next few moons, as she'd set the Lannister army and the Tarleys alight on the road back from Highgarden. Edmure, feeling they deserved it for sacking the Tarets home and expressing that never again would he have sympathy for the Lions or those who did their bidding, his lords surprisingly agreeing with him on that, when word came of events in the Dragon Pit and of the Dragon Queen's army traveling north with Jon Snow, Edmure didn't know what to make of it. The story itself was unbelievable, and yet the actions taken after made it seem as if it was true. Though it was the raven that came which really had he and his lord scrambling over what to do, his niece's words speaking of things that could lose all of them their heads. Although the more he thought on it, the more he was sure it would be flames or a dragon's teeth they'd face should they go along with what Sansa was suggesting. Yet there were some who wished it so. Others who wanted him to name himself their king and for them to rule their lands themselves. They'd taken it back without anyone's help after all, so why should they kneel to a dragon, a wolf, crazed lioness, or their preferred king's niece? Edmure quickly called the meeting to hear them all out before the calls became too loud and the choice was made for him. "You took our lands back, Lord Edmure. It was you who brought my son back to me. Why should I kneel to another?" Lord Norbert Vance said. "We fought against the dragons in the rebellion. Why join them now? As for the lions, I'd rather cut my cock off than kneel to Cersei, and though I mean no disrespect to you or your family, my lord, I know not your niece, other than she married the imp and the bastard of Bolton," Lemond said to some nods. "Against her will, Lord Lemond," he said reproachfully. "True, but she married them both all the same," Lemond said. "All of this is moot lest you wish it. We'd name you our king, Edmure. Just give us the word." Sir Mark said, and he looked to his friend and then to his wife. Rosianne, he could see, was thinking over what it would be like to be a queen. "Were this but a few years ago, then I'd snap your hands off, so eager would I be to wear a crown. But that man was a fool and has long since passed. The man in front of you is older and I'd hope wiser," he said to some laughs. "We cannot hold our lands, not against the lions, as we all know to our cost, but most certainly not against the dragons, should they come. Mark my words, my lords. It'll be dragons who rule these lands yet again." He could see nods of agreement around the hall, and he reached down to his glass before drinking it down quickly and ready to speak once more. "And yet that's not why I'll deny myself a crown or won't support my niece. We swore our oaths to a king who gave his blood for us all. My nephew, were he living today, would be our king still, would he not?" Aye. The voices called out, and he looked to see that some in the room knew where he was about to go, and he wondered what they and the others may say. "Our king named his brother his heir. I signed my name to his will and did so freely, and while I had no joy in doing so, I did it because my king willed it so. I know not this Jon Snow other than what my sister would speak of him, and though Cat bore the boy no love, she signed the will the same as I. You would ask us to kneel to a bastard, to a northern savage," another voice called out. "Was my nephew a northern savage? Were the men who bled for us at the Whispering Woods or outside these very walls? Were the men who died at the Twins northern savages?" he said angrily. The heads dropping around the room in shame at the words spoken by one of their number soon showed the truth of their feelings. "We shall bow but to our king, to Jon Snow, the king of the north and the trident. Long may he reign," he said, standing to his feet. "Jon Snow," Long may he reign. He called for a quill and some parchment, and wrote the note before fixing his seal to it and handing it to Vyman. "Send this to Winterfell," he said, as he handed in the scroll, and the Maester nodded as he hurried to do his bidding, Idmir turning to see his wife looking at him with a small and proud smile on her face. King's Landing 305 AC. Varys. He'd ridden hard to White Harbor, and then taken one of the fastest of the Queen's ships to Duskendal. Varys glad to see the Kraken sails had been fitted as per his request. Where the Iron Fleet itself was, he didn't know, but he couldn't take the risk that he'd fall into Euron Greyjoy's hands, and to sail in a single ship alone, bearing the Queen's colors, was foolhardy at best, and suicidal at worst. They made good time, though, and when he arrived in Duskendal, he considered reaching out to House Wrecker before deciding, in the end, it was best not to, for now. The ride to King's Landing was just as hard, and by the time he arrived, he was tired and his bones were stiff. Yet his heart was pumping as fast as it ever did with the knowledge that he was about to make a move in the great game. Entering the city was easy enough, Varys mixing with the other refugees who foolishly came here seeking aid. It did pain him seeing the tired and the hungry children and knowing they'd not find any respite behind these walls. Once inside the gates, he disappeared into the shadows, his little birds no longer his and his alone, and the risks to his life rising substantially because of it. Varys scurried through the back streets, down alleys and paths he knew far better than most, and soon enough came to his destination. The brothel, the last place a man with no cock would ever be expected to visit. And yet Chatia and his relationship had always been very mutually rewarding. He'd given her the coin to get started and had reaped the benefits of her help over the years. That he'd also kept her safe from Littlefinger's machinations had only increased the woman's loyalty and debt to him. A debt he now wished her to repay. "A spider comes to call," the voice said as he moved to knock at the back door, Varys turning to see Alaya walking his way while carrying a basket of fruit. "And will he find a safe web to call his home?" he asked, and received a warm smile from the girl. "Always, my lord," she said as she knocked on the door and bid him join her inside. When it was opened, he was shown to a room where a bath was quickly prepared for him. And though he wished to douse himself in his favorite perfume and wear the clothes he had stored here, he knew he could not. Varys instead, dressing simply though he left his disguise to one side for now. Elia brought him some food and some wine, and he was surprised by the quality of both, though the girl explained that with the Golden Company in the city, all of them ate well enough. The men spend coin as if it were they who shit gold, and not the Lannisters. Elia said, making him titter. "They visit often?" he asked as he took a bite of the peach. "They are so many, my lord. They visit and they wait." "Alizier," said her voice, concerned. "They wait?" "For the dragons." The girl said, her concern even more clear now. "You have nothing to fear from the dragons, Axlier. I serve their queen, and I've always seen you right, have I not?" "Yes, you have," an older woman's voice said, and Varys turned to see Chataya enter the room. "It's good to see you well, old friend," he said with a smile. "You too, my lord," she said back. Varys listened eagerly as Chataya told him the ins and outs of all that had occurred since the Golden Company had arrived. How there was tension between them and the Queen's men, and with the Ironborn most of all. She told him how some of the men had taken to guard her doors, and how a fight had occurred, where the men of gold had killed a half-dozen of Euron's men, who'd tried to cause her trouble. Varys relieved that none of those inside had been hurt, and pleased just as much by the news of rising tensions. They most disliked the Ironborn king, the Greyjoy. "I've heard many men speak of wishing to cut his throat." Alayad. "What say they about the Dragon Queen?" he asked as he took a sip of the wine. "That they're fools to be going up against her, and that if she beats the army of the dead, then what hope have they?" Chataya said. He listened some more as they spoke about how the Queen and the pirates seemed to enraptured by each other. Euron though spending more time in the Red Keep than on his ship, and Varys getting an idea how that could be useful. When Varys asked about Jon Connington, he found the man, though known to them, had never set foot in here or in any other brothel, preferring to do his drinking elsewhere. "Where do they stay, the leaders of the Golden Company?" he asked as he finished his wine and stood up. "By the docks, you'll find most of their men. They took the old Tyrell warehouse, and the leaders split their time between there and the Tyrell manse. I'll be back on the morrow," he said, and put on the beard. He made his way down the side streets, and first went to the manse. Soon hearing that Jon Connington had argued with Harry Strickland and was staying in the docks, after quickly making his way there, he found that the man was inside, and that he rarely left. It then took him 3 days to finally see Jon Connington in a position where he could reach him. Varys, having spent his nights watching over the warehouse, and only returning to Chadayez when he needed to change or to eat. During that time, a ship had arrived carrying a very interesting passenger, and Varys made plans to reach out to speak to him as soon as he could. For now, it was the man he followed that he needed to speak to, and once he was sure they were alone, Varys made his presence known. "I wondered when I'd see you, Spider, though I had thought I'd smell you first," Jon Connington said when he stepped out in front of him. "Alas, I find myself unable to be who I truly am," he said with a smirk. "Do you even remember who that man was, Spider?" Jon Connington said, and Varys made no reply to that at least, instead speaking on why he was here. "I come to bring you an offer. Do I have your ear?" he asked, looking at the man in front of him. Jon Connington staring back at him before nodding. "Is there somewhere we can speak freely?" "Ah, you truly are no longer a part of things here, if you must ask me that. Come, I know a place," Jon said, and he followed the man down the street. In truth, there were many places he could bring the man, but none he'd risk him knowing about until he judged him true. The building he was brought to was small, and the men in front of it were clearly Golden Company, though they wore no markers to identify them, so Varys followed Jon Connington inside and up some stairs and into a small room. Inside there was a table, some chairs, and a bed, and he looked on as Jon produced a bottle and some glasses and bid him take a seat. "I find myself to be in need of solitude from time to time, and here in this city I found little," Jon said, pouring out the wine and offering him a glass. "I hear your men in the Ironborn aren't on the best of terms," he said to begin, seeing Jon smile as he looked at him. "Why am I not be surprised about what you hear or that your little birds still sing?" Jon said, shaking his head. "Is it just the Krakens who vex you, Jon? Or mayhap it's the lions, too? Or do you still at night dream of dragons?" he asked, and saw the scowl appear on Jon Connington's face. "Careful, Spider, it's taken all I've got in me to not to end you already," Jon said angrily. "Understandable, though most lamentable if it should come to pass. You hate the Lannisters, Jon. The Ironborn, too. Your heart belongs, as it always has, to the Targaryens," he said, looking to the man, though he had no need to do so, to see that he was right. "The dragons are gone," Jon said, swallowing his wine and refilling the glass. "Not all," he said. "A girl, a sister. No, Varys, the dragons are dead," Jon said, his voice far sadder in its tone. "Had he lived, had he lived, Jon, if somehow Rogider's son had survived, who would your sword be raised for?" he asked, curious, for the reply. "He died. They all died, and only lesser men like you and I got to live." Jon said bitterly, "Close your eyes, Jon. Imagine a son of Racker lived still. Now, whose side would you be on?" "I've no need to close my fucking eyes, Spider. For fuck's sake, why would I? You know where my heart lay, just like you knew the truth of all of us back then. Had Aegon lived then, I'd have given my life in service of him, just as I'd have done for his father. I'd have crossed the world and seen it burn to put him on the Iron Throne. I'd have named him my king, and knelt without being asked to. But it's torture to think of such things, and I've tortured myself enough as it is." "You'd not have taken issue with his mother?" he asked, and saw Jon grip his glass and glare at him. "I was jealous of his mother, disliked her, and thought her to be unworthy of him, but damn it, she was my princess too. She would have been my queen, and mine own feelings matter not compared to that. Now enough with such thoughts. You're here for a reason. Get to it or get the fuck out." Jon said, his anger telling Varys all that he needed to know. Varys nodded to the bottle, and Jon filled his glass once more. He looked at the griffin and drank his wine down slowly before he readied to tell him a secret that few in the realm knew. "You know, a strange thing happened when I joined the Queen and went north. A revelation that came upon me all of a sudden, even though I'd known the man, spoken to him, and truth be told, found him honorable, if a bit dull. A realization came upon me when I went north and thought about Ned Stark." Varys said, "What the fuck has Ned Stark got to do with now?" Jon said a little too loudly, Varys raising his hand. "The man played the game better than any of us could have imagined. Those reasons may not have been how they seemed, and I find myself questioning them almost as much as he does each and every day," he said. "He? Jon Snow? His bastard?" Jon said, looking at him curiously. "Is he?" said with a smile. He began to tell him the tale of how Ned Stark had arrived at the Tower of Joy and found it to be guarded by 3 Kingsguard, the names of whom only confirming the truth and he saw how Jon Connington's breathing grew ever more shallow as he continued. The boy being named a bastard, being brought back to the north, and then many years later being sent to the wall, Varys telling the tale, then of what Jon Snow had done when there and seeing the smile that appeared unbidden on Jon Connington's face, when he got to the part about Jon Snow flying on a dragon and the way he'd spoken up for Daenerys when she arrived in the north, it was clear the man now knew the truth. "He's true?" Jon Connington said, his voice barely a whisper. "He's true. You knew Rackar better than I. Would he have lain with her, were it not so?" he asked, and Jon shook his head. "And Daenerys, she'll step aside?" he asked. "No, nor would he wish it so or even allow any to suggest it. Besides, there's no need, they've already wed," he said, and saw the smile grow large on the man's face. "What would you ask of me?" Jon asked, his voice far more hopeful than it had been just a few moments earlier. "Who do you serve, Jon?" "His name, Varys. What is his name?" Jon asked. His voice rushed. Now such was his eagerness to know. "Aegon Targaryen, the sixth of his name. My king and my queen, I serve the dragons, Varys, to the death." Jon said, and Varys nodded. They spoke, and Varys soon learned that a large number of the captains wished to be elsewhere. Strickland, Euron, Cersei, each of them receiving less and less loyalty from the Golden Company. To get them to fully turn, though, prices would need to be paid. Lands to be offered and given, but after the wars the realm had suffered, there were lands available. So Varys made some offers contingent on them coming through, and the king and queen agreeing to them, and Jon swore that he'd not offer more than could be accepted. "They will come?" Jon Connington asked hopefully. "They will come," he said, rising to his feet. "Be ready, Jon. The king and queen will have need of you then and after." He left the building and made his way back to Chadiaz. Finding that Sir Baelor had made his way there already, Varys wondered if he knew he was here, and when Chadiaz told him that the man hadn't partaken in any service she'd offered, and had in fact paid extra coin, just so she'd allow him to sup and eat in peace, he knew that he did. So he sent to Arya with the note and removed his disguise, and soon enough the heir to the high tower was brought into the room. "Sir Baelor, I believe you've been expecting me," he said, as the man took his seat. "I have, Lord Varys. I bring you word from my father," Baelor said, handing him the letter. He rode out of the city that night, the horse riding harder and faster than it had to even get here. The news he needed to bring to the king and the queen even better than he had dared to hope. His heart was beating as fast as it ever had, as once again he'd played the game and once again he was on the winning side. Varys laughing as he thought of the foolish amateur moves that Tyrion and Sansa Stark were about to make. Moves that were pointless as the game was already over. The only thing they'd find was the one truth that any who played already knew. You play the Game of Thrones and you win or you die, and this game was already won. Winterfell 305 AC. Aegon. He had carried Bran himself to the crypts, Arya walking beside him, and while he felt nothing for the thing in his arms, he did for his sister. Arya did his very best to try and portray Bran's last moments as a heroic sacrifice, and not as a failed attempt to save himself. After sending for some cloth and some water, both he and Arya washed down the body themselves, his little sister looking for marks or injuries and finding none. Looking at the confused look on her face made him try to explain that it was likely that Bran's heart just gave in. That the pressure of warding and fighting against the Night King became too much for him, and not that the three-eyed raven had burned in dragon's flames, leaving the shell that had been their brother behind. They placed Bran in an unsealed box next to his father, Arya offering prayers for her brother while Aegon offered his own, which were certainly not. Instead, he thanked his mother for her help and told her how much he loved her before taking his sister's hand and leading her from the crypts. Though he wished to go to Dany, he knew they needed to make the preparations for the other funerals, and so he kissed Arya on the forehead, and together with Jaime Lannister, he set off to do just that. Finding out along the way more about who exactly they had lost and finding some deaths hit him harder than others. The Nori had fallen as had Beric and Podrick. There was also some of the free folk he knew that had lost their lives too, but far fewer than he'd feared. Lord Yaxon and almost two-thirds of the Knights of the Vale had fallen as well, and explaining that they'd not ridden through as ordered and had stopped to fight the dead. Learning that Howland Reed was dead brought up strange emotions in him. Aegon still not truly sure how he had felt about the man, that he had come when he had made things easier in a way, but he wasn't sure that he could ever forgive the man for waiting so long. Not just from when Robb died either, but even before then. Howland had known, and yet had left him in ignorance, and Aegon couldn't help but wonder what his life would have been like had the man come earlier to tell him who he was. Even thinking about what he'd done at the Tower of Joy brought up some conflicted feelings for him, that he'd traveled under the assumption he was going to rescue his mother, made him respect the man a little, that once he'd gotten there, he'd killed Sir Arthur Dayne, made him hate him a little more. Had he not, had Sir Arthur lived, Aegon was sure that he'd have met Dany earlier, and that they'd have taken their throne back much sooner. But when he thought about that, he wondered what would have happened beyond the wall. What would have happened to the free folk and even to the Starks had he not lived the life he lived? It was a thread he felt best not pulled at for now. "When everyone is organized, we'll send for the Queen," he said to Yami, who nodded. The knight looking at him oddly, "Is everything well, Sir Yami?" "It is, your grace. I take it we shall march south soon." "We shall, sir, once we've made our plans and rested a little." "You're having second thoughts about what needs to be done." "No, your grace. I would only ask, if at all possible, that you may consider a different fate for my sister," the knight said as he looked off into the distance. "I'll discuss it with her grace. I won't ask you to fight against your family, Sakshime. If you wish, you can sit this one out and just do your duties as a Kingsguard," he said, offering Jaime the closest to a way out that he could. "Fighting is part of my duties. You have my sword, your grace, truly." James said, and he nodded, hoping that the man spoke the truth. It took them some time to organize everything. There were some bodies were to be burned and others that would be sent back to their families. Lord Yonson and Howland would both be among the latter, while Beric, who believed truly in the Lord of Light, and Melisandre, who they'd found collapsed in the snow, and who seemed older than any woman any had ever seen, would both be given to the fires. Dany stood beside him, and though there were fewer pyres than he'd seen in his vision, and some who'd fallen then stood now, he still felt the loss. Though when he glanced at Sarah Jara, Lady Meg, and Lyanna Mormont, and saw Ed standing off to his left, he thanked the gods for their lives too. "To the brave fallen, we who survived, salute you," Aegon said as he stepped forward with the torch in his hands. "Your loss, your sacrifice will never be forgotten. Your heroism will be spoken about often, and your names sang loudly in the years to come. The North remembers," Aegon said as he dipped the torch onto the barracks pyre. "The North remembers," the voices, as one shouted loudly behind him. It took some time for the flames to burn out, and Aegon, Dany, and the others all stood and waited until they had before they turned back and walked the keep. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw Arya walk closely with Gendry, and he gave her a small smile and nod before he turned to the woman beside him. Reaching his hand out, he took Dany's in his own and led her back in through the gates and the keep, the two of them heading to their room to ready for the night's festivities. Later, as they stood there getting dressed, Aegon found himself trying his best not to laugh at Dany's annoyance about the night to come. "Do we have to go?" Dany said, putting on her dress while he tried not to look at her, knowing if he did, they'd not leave the room. "We must. They need this, my love, as do we," he said, moving over to her and nibbling on her neck. "And I promise to make it up to you once the night is done," he said, his voice low as she now leaned into him. "You had better," she said, almost with a pout, which did make him laugh. "Missandei and Davos should be heading back. They'll be here in a few days," he said as she finished dressing. Dany smiling broadly at the idea of seeing her friend again. "They know?" she asked. "As much as listening to a wolf would tell them, Ghost has made it clear it's done and they're to return," he said as he finished buttoning up his jacket. "Shall we?" "If we must," Dany said, rolling her eyes and making him laugh more fully. He was still doing so when they reached the Great Hall. Aegon had realized that he'd laughed far more since he'd been shown the truth of things than he had perhaps in his entire life up to then. It was a thought that had struck him more than once since he'd told Deanne the truth of who he was. There was a difference between finding things amusing and being happy, and if you were the latter, then life seemed to offer you so much more of the former. Taking their seats, he looked around the room and was surprised to see Tormund sitting with the Mormonons, though not at all. To see Jaime Lannister sitting with Brienne. The woman was still mourning the loss of her squire, it seemed, and Jaime was doing his best to offer her what comfort he could. Rhaenyra was sitting with Gendry and a few others that he didn't recognize, and when Corno saw him, he raised his mug, Aegon doing the same in return and taking a big swallow, much to the man's approval. As the night went on, he was joined by Ned Dane and unfortunately by his cousin too, Ser Gerold taking the opportunity to speak to Dany while he was engaged in talking to Ned. "I would never have believed it, your grace, the dead, had I not seen them for myself," Ned said, holding his mug in his hand. Aye, I know. Years, maybe even weeks or moons from now, people will name us liars or call us mad. They'll say it was wildings, savages, or something else we fought and we built it up as an army of dead men. He said, trying not to look too obviously at the man behind him, who was now sitting far too close to his wife. It bothers you, Your Grace, that you'll not be believed? Ned asked, as Aegon took a drink from his mug. Lord Stark never spoke of the war. Did you know that? He asked, and Ned shook his head. He never told tales of what he did or what he'd seen, never corrected a statement or called anyone a liar for what they said of it or him. As he spoke the words, he tried not to let the bitterness he felt about his uncle come through. He'd always thought it yet another example of his uncle's honor. But he knew better now. His uncle didn't speak about the war because it shamed him. What he did during and after at the Tower of Joy, and with him, he was shamed by it, and rightly so. So, rather than speak of it or correct anyone when they did, he instead took credit for killing Sir Arthur Dayne rather than speak the truth. His uncle had also allowed people to name his father a rapist and kidnapper rather than correct them for their lies, honor only a word to the Honorable Ned Stark. Aegon thought bitterly. Your Grace? Ned asked, and Aegon realized that he'd drifted off into his head. I'm sorry, Lord Dayne. To answer your question, no, it doesn't bother me. I know what I did, what all these men here did, you included. And, like the North, I remember, let others forget and let them claim what they wish. They had just better not do so within my hearing. Brave men lost their lives here. Men who fought with honor, men with families and loved ones. So let men who weren't here name them liars, but they had best do so quietly and far from me, he said, and Ned nodded. I don't know of Dorne, Your Grace. They know not of you and her Grace's marriage. And I was sent to offer our fealty only to her Grace, Ned said, as is owed to her, he said, looking to his wife, who was now laughing at something Ser Gerold said. As it is, it's owed to you too, and while Dorne may need more time to see that, I do not. I'd kneel should you ask it of me. Ned said, looking at him, though Aegon was paying far more attention to his wife behind him. Not today, he said, reaching out and placing a hand on the man's shoulder. Today is a day for heroes, Ned, and heroes have no need to kneel, he said, as he rose to his feet and turned to his wife. He held his hand out and almost glared at Ser Gerold, the man's face schooled, but his eyes blazing, and Aegon knew that at some point they'd be having words at least. Dany smiled at him and took his hand, and they moved out onto the floor. The dancing hadn't truly begun, but as soon as they moved the music began to play, and people looked their way. Taking his wife in his arms, he began to dance. Aegon thanking the gods he'd received lessons, even though Lady Catelyn had not wished it so. Ser Gerold is amusing, he asked, as they moved, and Dany chuckled as she leant in closer to him. Is my husband jealous? She asked, smirking all the time. Madly, fiercely, always, he said as he bit her neck softly. And if I said that he had nothing to be jealous about? Dancy had her smile still on her face, though he could see her eyes were a little worried. It would make no difference. When it comes to you, I find myself jealous of everything, he said as she looked at him. Such as? She asked, and Aegon saw they'd finally been joined by others, his eyes catching his sister shaking her head, as Gendry obviously asked her if she wished to dance. The sun that beams down upon her when she wakes in the morning before me, the clothes she wears that get to cover her all through the day, the water in her bath that gets to flow over her as she bathes, and the sheets at night that she wraps herself in, he said, and watched as her smile grew ever larger. I did not know you could speak such words, Jon Snow, she said, her voice soft and light. Nor I, not until you, my love, he said, as they began to kiss. There were things that needed to be said, toast that needed to be made, and soon plans that needed to be put into action. They needed to speak on Tyrion, who would probably return, and on Sansa, who would not. They had to decide if they were to wait on Varys and how much time they needed to give the dragons and the men to rest before they marched. And yet, all of that was for another day, another time. Aegon held his wife in his arms and was lost in the kiss he shared with her, the feelings he felt for her, and then visions which came to him as they stood in the middle of the great hall. Visions he'd had once before, and were now even clearer to him. Aegon, she asked when he broke the kiss, and he smiled to show her that all was well. He led her back to the table, glad to see that Ser Gerold was nowhere to be seen, and that Ned Dayne had kept his seat. Leaning in close to her, he kissed her once more before he spoke softly in her ear, and told her that he had a need to use the privy. The embarrassed look he tried to put on his face, seeming to work as she giggled when she took her seat. Aegon passed by TARGERIYAN and Arya with 2 Unsullied following at his back as he walked to the nearest privy, and once inside he felt the contents of his stomach empty when he leaned over the hole. It was real. It was real. I killed the woman I loved, he said as his body heaved once more. Winterfell 3005 AC. Aegon. He knelt in front of the tree and beseeched the gods to tell him why, and to explain to him why they'd shown him such things. For 2 days he'd come here first thing in the morning and just before he retired for the night, Dany accepting his word that he felt the need to pray and to thank the gods for their success. As he'd knelt and spoken to them, though he'd done anything but thank them. Aegon cursing them instead for what they'd revealed to him. No matter how much he pleaded, they didn't answer, the gods gifting him with nothing but silence and memories. Each one of those was like the knife to the heart that he'd plunged in the woman he love's chest. Aegon now clearly seeing just how truly Dany had fallen, and though his anger was directed at everyone, those who'd enabled her fall, those who'd caused it, the gods for not stepping in to stop it, but he reserved his true disdain and disgust for himself. How could I? Why was I so blind? Was she bearing our babe? The last question always the one he found himself going back to. And the one which, just as it had the first time he'd thought it, now once again had him emptying the contents of his stomach into the dark waters of the pool. It was a question he needed the answer to, and one he dared not find the truth of. The thoughts of being a kinslayer twice over, ones that, should he find the truth of, would be the end of him. Eyes closed, he reached out and touched the weirwood, and was once again transported in time, his hair gray and his skin old and wrinkled, while the cold bite of the northern air chilled him to the bone. In front of him was a very different weirwood, older, bigger, and Aegon felt himself kneeling at it just as truly as if it was the one he was kneeling at in Winterfell. He felt the regrets, the shame, the anger, and the hopelessness the old man felt, as if he and the man were one. Something he knew now to be true, and then, as the man in Winterfell faded away, Aegon opened his eyes to see he was no longer there, or himself, but he was now the old man by the tree. He wrote the words on the tree using the soot, the words that named him by both his true name and what he was, and after doing so, he closed his eyes, and then once again, he saw her own. For once it wasn't the color that drew him in, or even the looks of love she wore in them that he remembered so well before he'd thrown it all away. No, it was the understanding, the way she seemed to look deep inside of him and just knew what it was he was feeling. There was no recrimination, no anger. True, there was some regret, but mainly it was a look that told him that she knew. She understood. And for Aegon, that was even better than forgiveness. Forgiveness was too much. It was a step too far. Something he didn't wish for or wouldn't accept, and something he knew he didn't deserve. And so to see it in her eyes would only make her untrue. He didn't think he could bear that. She was the only true thing he'd ever known. And to see her even now, even after all he'd done, still being who she was a blessing. Aegon longed to hear her voice, to feel her touch, to hold her in his arms, one final time, but they were just dreams. And he'd long accepted that his life was merely a nightmare of his own choosing. Not just yours, my love. The voice rang out into the night, and Aegon opened his eyes to see where it had come from. Dany, he called out hopefully, though he knew it hadn't been her voice. He heard. No, my son, it's not, the woman said as she walked from the cave. Aegon seeing her dark hair and gray eyes and not needing to ask her name. I failed. Every step of the way, everything I did in my life, I failed, he said as his tears fall, and he looked to her and waited to be judged. Good, now go fail again, she said, and Aegon looked on as she faded from his view. Mother, he called out, but the sound that returned was not the voice of a woman or a man. It was a sound he'd not heard in almost 50 years, and it was coming closer. He stood up and held his arms out, fully extended to his side. He then bowed his head and waited for him to come. Truth be told, he'd expected him long before now, he wondered. Did he wait until he had suffered enough and was ready to give in? Aegon had come here to die. His time was up, and his strength sapped. He'd seen it all again over the past few moons, the betrayals, her fall, his mistakes, and their true intent. Bran wanted only to live, Sansa wanted a crown. Arya was so lost inside herself and just wanted to be free. Sam wanted revenge and a comfortable life, while Tyrion wanted a woman he couldn't have. Others wished for things too. Varys waned the realm to be secure and the people safe. Davos wanting an end to the wars and to people's suffering, and Jaime Lannister wanted a reason to live rather than a reason to die. Dany had wanted him. She'd wanted to have a family and to have a man who loved her and not the dragon queen she had at times to be. As for him, what did he want? What had he always wanted? It had taken him until the end of his life to realize it. It wasn't to be a king, to wear a crown, to be Lord of Winterfell, or to be a Stark. Nor was it to have the respect of the man he thought was his father, or was it the love of his brother and sisters. "You know nothing, Jon Snow," the voice called out, and as he heard the Dragonland he smiled. Aegon opened his eyes and looked into the deep red ones of Drogon. The dragon, the only one whose judgment he'd accept in the time for that judgment, was now finally upon him. As he saw the flames rise in the back of Drogon's throat, Aegon saw the images flash in front of his eyes. Dragonstone. Dany, Winterfell. Dany, the cabin of a ship. Dany, the waterfall. Dany, he saw her smile, heard her laugh, and almost felt her fingertips on his face. As Drogon's flames came over him and the weirwood, as he and the tree both were engulfed, Aegon knew exactly what it was he wanted. "I want another chance," he said as the flames burned both him and the tree away. He felt the shaking and looked up to see Jaime Lannister with his hands on his shoulders, a panicked look on the knight's face. It took him a moment to realize that he was dripping wet, and then he was covered in a cloak and helped to his feet. By the time he reached the keep, he'd found out that he'd been dragged from the water by Jaime and he was making excuses for why he'd fallen in. Aegon saw that while Jaime didn't believe them, he at least accepted them for now. "Thank you, Sir Jaime," he said, and the knight nodded as he helped him to his room. As soon as she saw him, she was on her feet, Dany moving him to the fire, and she and Jaime both insisting that he get out of the damp clothes. Aegon was glad when the knight left with a nod to him, and soon enough he was sitting by the fire wrapped in a blanket, and yet he felt no cold. He should be shivering, shaking, and yet he felt no cold. His wife looked worriedly at him, and he saw her go to speak to Saros Jaime, Aegon ready for the shouting, when she came back. It wasn't what she did, though. Instead, she simply knelt down and looked into his eyes. That understanding look on her face was there once more, and he knew he had to tell her some of the truth. "I had a vision. I think I fell into the pool because of it," he said, and she looked at him a little worried now. "Is this like the other?" she asked. "More of it. We have much to do, Dany, much to do," he said, reaching out to take her hand and pull her close, as he began to tell her some of what he'd seen and what they needed to do. Winterfell 3005 AC. Ser Davos, seeing Winterfell's walls in front of him, made him almost feel as if he was coming home. Davos wondering if that was the place or the man he was heading to see, quickly deciding it was the latter. After losing his sons, he'd been lost and had sought some meaning for everything that he'd given up while following Stannis to the ends of the realm. He'd found that in Jon Snow, no Aegon Targaryen, but he'd found something else also. He'd found someone he considered a son. It was strange as he'd not particularly liked the boy when he first met him. Davos thinking him too rigid and set in his ways, something he laughed at now. The very traits he'd respected in Stannis he'd found annoying in Jon Snow, and it had taken him time to figure out why that was. Here in the north, he'd found out the reason for it. The boy was not being true to himself, and was almost a shadow of who he should be. Seeing him grow and become who he was always supposed to be was like watching the sun rise on a dark day, and Davos was happy to be a part of whatever was to come because of it. Arriving at the gates, he saw the Dornish men who'd passed them on the road, the young Dane lads sparring while others watched. He looked to see Tormund speaking with Lyanna Mormont and her mother, and smiled when the man caught his eye. Tormund's voice soon booming across the yard as he came toward them. "The Onion Knight," Tormund shouted as Davos climbed from his horse and helped Missandei down from hers, her own eyes searching the yard before finally seeing who she sought. "Forgive me, Ser Davos," she said as she moved from him and walked towards Grey Worm. "The half-man," Tormund said, and Davos turned to see Tyrion hurrying his way. "The fight?" Davos asked before Tyrion arrived. "Was glorious, Davos. The Dragon Queen rained down fire. The cockless men fought a mighty battle, and the horse lords ran over those dead fuckers like they were nothing," Tormund said, smiling. "The king?" he asked. "Stabbed that icy fucker through the heart, jumped from his dragon onto the other one's back, and took him to the ground." Tormund said, still smiling broadly. "You saw this?" Tyrion asked, breathing deeply as he stopped beside them. The Dragon Queen saw it, and I saw the dead fall. Tormund said, looking down at Tyrion. My brother is alive and well, as are far more of us than should be, Tormund said with a loud laugh. Grey Worm and Missandei walked over after having their own reunion, and Davos was then told of the losses they suffered. Lord Yarloris's death brought a frown to Tyrion's face, while he was saddened by Lord Beric's and Lord Reed's. All in all, though they'd lost only a few thousand men, even less than Stannis had lost at Blackwater Bay, and Davos felt his pride rise at what his king and queen had accomplished. Where's Ghost? Missandei asked, and Davos turned to look for the wolf, not seeing him anywhere. Make your way to King Crow's door, and you'll no doubt find the White Wolf, Tormund said with a chuckle. Davos looked to Missandei and Grey Worm, who seemed just about to do that, and so he nodded to them and began to walk with them. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw Lord Wyman speaking to the Mormons, and as they entered the keep, he saw Ser Jorah heading their way. He didn't wait to hear what the man said to Tyrion, but he was sure that the dwarf would not be joining them in meeting with the king and queen. When they reached the room and were let in, Missandei quickly brushed past him, Davos watching as she and the queen greeted each other with a hug. His own greeting with his king seemed to be a bit more formal, he thought, before he too was welcomed just as Missandei had been. It's good to see you, your grace, both of you, he said, looking to Daenerys, who was speaking to Missandei, and so barely noticed him. You too, Davos, you've heard? Aegon asked. The battle? Aye. Did you really jump from a fucking dragon's back? He asked it admonishingly, hearing the queen's laugh as he did so. I tried to tell him not to risk himself so. Lord Davos, but it seems even an order from the queen isn't enough to make my husband listen. Daenerys said, taking her seat as Missandei did likewise. We won, didn't we? Aegon said, rolling his eyes and making both the queen and Missandei laugh a little more fully. He took his seat and told of their time on the road, of Sansa Stark riding off, and of Tyrion keeping to himself. Missandei saying that she didn't like the looks he gave them both, nor how silent he remained while they were heading south. What did he say when he realized you weren't going to White Harbor? Aegon asked. It caught him by surprise, your grace, and he was not best pleased. Missandei said. Good, we can use that. Aegon said, as he looked at him curiously before speaking, do you wish to get settled in, or would you prefer to work? Work first, that way I won't be worrying about what I'm supposed to be doing, he said to a chuckle from the king. Aegon got up from his seat and walked over to place a kiss on his wife's lips before telling Missandei how happy he was to see her back, something the queen clearly agreed with. Then he nodded to and looked to Ghost, who Davos hadn't even noticed was curled up by the fire. Aegon walked to the door and let the wolf run off while he followed him from the room. They left the keep and walked out onto the walkway and stood there, looking down at the courtyard. Aegon motioning to the Unsullied to guard both ends of it so they'd not be disturbed. When you're settled, there's something I need to speak to you about, Davos. Something I need to speak to someone about. Again said, his voice shaky as he leaned on the wooden handrail, his posture stiff and unyielding. Of course, your grace, he said, and saw how his shoulders seemed to relax. For now we have other matters at hand. Soon we'll be heading south to King's Landing. We'll deal with all of those who stand between my wife and her throne, and then we can finally begin to heal this realm and see its people prosper. Aegon said, I thought our losses would be much steeper, your grace, given they are not. We have more than enough men, and we have the dragons too. I doubt Cersei Lannister or Euron Greyjoy can stand against her grace and yourself. They are not the only enemies we have, Aegon said, drawing his attention to Tyrion. Nor, as luck would have it, are the forces here the only allies we can call upon either. Davos looking on as Aegon smiled at Ned Dane, who was using Dawn to hold 2 men at bay. What is it that Dorne wants, your grace? He asked. Justice, vengeance, Cersei Lannister's head on a pike with Euron Greyjoy's beside it. We promise them that, and they'll swear to Daenerys, Aegon said, and Davos noticed that he'd not mentioned himself. But not you, he asked. For now, Sir Davos, for now, Aegon said, with a smile. Your grace, fancy a spar? Ned Dane called up when he noticed them watching. He chuckled when he saw the smirk on Aegon's face. Davos seeing him nod before he turned to him and leaned in close. After we've eaten tonight, meet me in the Godswood, Yaxod, and he nodded as the king turned to walk away from him before he stopped to look back. Davos, it's good that you've returned. Truly, it is. Aegon said before he walked away. As much as he'd have enjoyed watching the spar, he felt the chill in the air and felt ready to get comfortable in his room for a bit. The thoughts of Al and a warm fire were ones he found most pleasing. He turned to walk from the walkway when he saw Jaime Lannister and Tyrion heading out the gate. Davos wondering where the two men were going and then looking on, surprised as Ghost followed out silently after them. Aegon looking up at him as he reached the courtyard, and Davos saw the look on his face that told him the wolf was about the king's business this day. Shaking his head as he laughed a little, he walked into the keep and down to his room. Inside he found the fire to be already lit, while a large jug filled with ale and a plate of cold meat and cheese lay on his table. Davos took a seat as he then noticed the small note that lay beside the ale and food. Pouring himself a mug of ale, he opened the note and read it. Rest up, Davos, we have much to do. Jon, the Vale of Arryn, 305 AC. Sansa Stark. She hated riding, the discomfort, the cold. Even sitting on the horse itself was something she disliked immensely. When you added in the smells that came from the horses and from the men who rode with her, not that she herself had been able to bathe properly either for days, it made her long for carriages once more. In the future, when she was queen, she'd insist she traveled in a manner becoming of one. A large wheelhouse like the one Cersei Lannister had was to her the only way a true queen should travel. Only a savage who lived among other savages would think a queen should ride a horse. It was just another example to her of why Daenerys Targaryen wasn't fit to be queen. She spent her time among filthy savages. She drank and ate with them, even went so far as to drink that foul drink that the wildlings were known for. No, a queen was supposed to be above it all. She looked down over her people and gave them something to aspire to. When she ate, she did so delicately, picking the food from her plate and washing it down only with the finest wines. Cersei Lannister was a mad, cruel woman, but she was far more of a queen than the dragons could ever be. Sansa, though, would put them both to shame. She'd be thought of as good Queen Sansa, would be beloved by her subjects and admired by the ladies of the realm. She'd be lusted after by knights and lords, and yet none would ever stand the slightest chance of gaining her favor. Sansa shuddering at the thoughts of a man ever touching her again, and yet she knew that she'd have to let one do so in the future. The Bloody Gate, Lady Sansa. Sir Davos said, taking her from her daydream, and Sansa looked to see the large wall that stood in front of them. Is there a keep inside? She asked, not seeing anything other than the parapets and the covered bridge. There's a small garrison, and while the accommodations aren't up to a true keep, they're far better than those we've stayed in to get here, my lady. Sir Davos said. Sansa, though, displeased, accepted that the idea of a warm fire, a bed, and a bath, and some hot food was something she could appreciate. They rode to the gate itself, and she looked up as a man loomed large over them. His armor was dark and gray, and she remembered that her uncle had once served here. The Knight of the Bloodgate, she'd heard Robb name him once. Sansa briefly felt sadness, thinking she'd never met the man. Only for it goes she remembered he'd not come to her aid when called. Who would pass the Bloody Gate? The knight shouted, and Sansa looked to see that there was a septon standing beside him, something that she found most strange. Sotaveth Hersey, escorting the Lady Sansa Stark to meet with Lord Robert. Sotaveth said, and Sansa saw the knight on the bridge nod, and the gate was then opened. Lyanne helped her from her horse, and her escort all dismounted, as the knight who'd greeted them from the bridge headed their way, along with some guards. Suntir, looking and trying to see and recognize the sigil he bore. The broken black wheel was on a green field, and her mind went quickly to the books she'd read when she had stayed with her aunt and cousin. Smiling as she soon remembered it was from House Waynwood, but she could not place the man's name. Sir Daveth, I had not expected to see you back so soon, Lord Yan. The others? The knight asked. Readying for battle, Sir Daveth said. Donal. Sir Donal Waynwood, Lady Anya's second son. Sansa's mind quickly placed the man, and she thanked Littlefinger for his insistence that she learn as much as she could about the Vale. What his original plans were for her there she had never known, only that something had caused them to change. Sansa still feeling the effects of that change today, she thought as she almost felt the scars. Lady Sansa, a pleasure. Sir Donal said, and Sansa smiled when he kissed her. Offered hand. The knight was plain and homely, but he at least understood the courtesies she was most pleased to find. Sir Donal, she said, and looked to Theon, who watched the knight's every move. Sansa, thankful for his protective stare as she spoke to the man. They were quickly brought into the keep, which she found was far larger than Ser Def had said, and Ser Donal soon had a room and a bath prepared for her. Sansa was delighted to see that there were oils and scented soaps laid out by the servants for her, and before she knew it, she was relaxing in the warm water. She drank some wine and ate some grapes and some candied fruits as she lay there, finding that by the time she was ready to climb out, the water had begun to cool. Sansa dried and dressed herself, but she allowed the servant to brush her hair before she headed to the small hall for the evening meal. In the hall, it was as if she was in a different world. The food was plentiful, the wine flowed, and, though she was the only high-born lady present, it didn't diminish her enjoyment of the meal she ate or the night ahead of her. Sansa even dancing with Ser Donal, some of the other knights, and Theon, though she had to almost drag him to the floor to do so, as he seemed more nervous here than he had been in Winterfell. She welcomed the advances of the knights, though politely turned them down. Still, it was comforting to find that she was much desired. That had been one of her greatest worries, because of all she'd been through. The idea that the scars she covered up could still be seen in her features was one that filled her with dread. She needed to be desired, to be wanted, to play on men and use that weapon that Cersei had told her they all possessed. Her name alone wasn't going to be enough to get her what she wished, and should the truth of her position reach the Vale before she made her move, then she'd be done for. But a man's desire was a useful tool to use, and seeing how the men in the hall looked at her, it was one that she'd be able to take advantage of still. Lord Robert will be so pleased to see you, my lady. I fear he's missed family these past few moons. Ser Donal said as they sat the high table. As will I to see my cousin too, Ser Donal. I find myself missing true family more and more, she said truthfully. We'll arrange to change the horses on the morrow, Lady Sansa. I wish I could offer you a carriage of some sort, but all we have are carts, and that's no way for a lady such as yourself to travel. Ser Donal said with a smile. I thank you, good sir. I must beg your forgiveness, though. I find myself most tired and in need of rest, she said, smiling back at the man and noticing his disappointed look at her leaving. The odd ear escorted her back to her room, and she welcomed the feel of the warm bed as she lay down upon it before she quickly undressed. Her sleep was far more peaceful than it had been while on the road, and she wondered, was it because she was now closer to her goal? When she woke the next morning, she was eager to be on her way, moving quickly to break her fast and almost hurrying the others along. She could see that Ser Donal and the other men were less pleased. She was leaving, and she wondered how many of them had thoughts of her the night before. Ser Donal, thank you for making my stay here most pleasant. I'll be sure to inform my cousin of your gallantry and attentiveness, she said with a smile, and saw the man's chest puff up. You are a most welcome guest, my lady, most welcome, the knight said, kissing her outstretched hand. It took them another 2 full days to arrive at the gates of the moon. Sansa, feeling all the good work the bath and warm bed had done her, had been for naught. Her hips and thighs ached, she smelt once more, and her hair was in dire need of a wash and a brush. She felt it even more keenly when she was greeted by a beautiful woman with quite a large bust that she had clearly on display, alongside another dark-haired girl and some knights. Sir Davith, one of the knights said, while the dark-haired girl moved forward. My father, sir, the girl asked. Lord Yoni has stayed in Winterfell to take part in the fight to come, my lady. He tasked me with escorting Lady Sansa to her cousin, Lord Robert, Ser Davith said. Lady Sansa, forgive me, the girl with the large bust said as she moved forward to greet her. There's nothing to forgive, lady, she asked with her eyebrow raised. Lady Miranda Royce, may I present Sir Michael and Lady Yaxley, Eula Redfort, and Sir Harold Harding, Miranda said, and Sansa was greeted politely by Sir Michael and suspiciously by Lady Yaxley, though most warmly by Sir Harold. Lady Sansa, a pleasure, truly, the blonde-haired, blue-eyed man said, kissing her hand. Sansa, finding herself lost in his eyes for a moment before she caught and steadied herself. Sir Harold, Lady Miranda, perhaps I can be escorted to my cousin, she asked to a slight frown from Sir Harold. This way, Lady Sansa, Miranda said, and Sansa followed her and Sir Harold with Theon walking behind her, while Sir Mitchell, Lady Isela, and Sir Davith stayed back and spoke to each other. She was led into the great hall and was surprised by just how full it was. Knights, lords, ladies, it seemed she'd arrived in the middle of a feast or ball of some sort. She looked to the high table and saw her cousin Robin looking just as weak and sickly as he ever had, though when he saw her, he smiled brightly. Sansa, he called out happily. Oh, cousin, it's so good to see you, she said, her smile and the flushing of her eyelids soon drawing an even bigger one of his own. He insisted she sat beside him, and over the course of the next few hours they spoke. She touched his arm, his shoulder, and even briefly his leg. She laughed at his japes, which weren't funny, and leaned in close to speak into his ear. At the end of the night, he escorted her to a room he'd had made up for her near his own. And when he leaned in to place a kiss on her cheek, she moved her face so he made contact with her lips. Sansa welcoming the surprised look on his face when she did so. "I hope we can spend lots of time together, Robin. Lots of time. I so wish us to be close, don't you?" she said, brushing his hand and moving his hair from his face. Robin staring at her with widened eyes. "I do, cousin, very much so," he said. And this time she leaned forward and placed a kiss on his lips herself before turning to walk into her room. Men were easy, she thought, as she readied for her bed. Cersei had been so very right about that. All they truly wished for was what was between a woman's legs, and Robin already wanted what was between hers. Soon enough, he'd give her everything she wished for, just on the off chance that she'd allow him what he desired. It was a small price to pay, she thought, as she lay down and covered herself with the sheet. A small price to pay for what it was she truly desired. Winterfell 30:05 AC. Tyrion. He was stunned by what he heard. They'd won so easily. Was the threat not as great as he'd been led to believe? Was it some sort of mummery that Jon Snow had played out? He needed answers, and it was clear he wasn't going to get them from the king or queen, not yet at least, which left him but one option. Jaime, that his brother had survived and was unharmed, was a huge relief, though given he was beginning to doubt just what odds they'd faced. Perhaps not. Still, he was happy when Jaime agreed to join him for a drink in the tavern in Wintertown. Walking from the keep with no guards irked him once more, though again, not because he feared he was in any sort of danger. More, it was yet another acknowledgement that his safety was not something his queen concerned herself with. Another sign of just how far he'd fallen and how much trouble he was truly in if he couldn't gain access to the inner council. Without his position, he was nothing. His name, unlike Jaime's, wouldn't bring him favor. And he wasn't a warrior who could inspire men to fight for him. He didn't even have the gold to pay them to do so, which was yet another reason he needed to be close to power. Destitution was not something he looked forward to. "I'm afraid you'll have to pay," he said with a chuckle. As he and Jaime entered the tavern, his brother nodding, and soon enough they sat over ale and warm food. Jaime didn't eat or drink while he did much of both, gladly accepting the second mug of ale when it was offered. His brother looked different to him. Jaime was focused on something that were he not so concerned with his own prospects. Tyrion may have inquired about, but he'd not come here to discuss his brother, not truly. After finishing the food and starting on his third mug of ale, he began to ask some of the questions that preyed on his mind. "The battle," he asked. "Like none I've ever known, Tyrion. To see them all, to see so many of them come at you. Gods, I'd not be here today were it not for their graces." Ishame said. "It was truly that bad?" he asks, surprised. "I don't know how many were in the army, but we burned thousands, tens of thousands. At the end I had lost my sword and I would have fallen." Jaime said, reaching out and taking the first swallow from his own mug. "What happened?" he asked, moving forward in his seat. "The king happened," Jaime said with a smile. Tyrion listened as he was told the same story that he'd heard, Jon Snow jumping from a dragon's back and taking down Viserion before slaying the Night King. It was a wondrous tale, and yet Jaime, like others, didn't see it. Something his brother wasn't best pleased with his doubts when he brought it up. "I care not for what you or anyone else says on this, Tyrion. Those there, we know what we know. We may still have won. Our numbers were greater than theirs by the end, but we'd have lost so many more to do. So, as it was, we lost enough." "You had a Podrick?" Jaime asked. "No," he said, before realizing what Jaime was saying. "He fell," he said softly. "He fell," Jaime said sympathetically. They sat in silence for a few moments, Jaime taking another swallow of the ale, and Tyrion thinking back on the boy who'd saved his life so many years earlier. He raised his mug and offered a toast that Jaime joined in with, and then he swallowed down what was left in the mug in order to refill. He was trying to think of how to bring up his issues with Daenerys and Jon Snow when the bolt struck the wall, Jaime turning his head as Bronn stepped out of the shadows with the crossbow still in his hands. "Sir Bronn of the Blackwater, where's your drink?" he asked before looking to his expression. "What are you doing north?" "What are you doing with that?" Jaime asked, looking to the crossbow as Tyrion finally recognized it. "Oh, this, for you both of a gift from your sister." Unfortunately, like all gifts that come from cunts, this one has a price too. Your sister offered me River Run to end you both. If you believe Cersei will keep to any promise she gave you, then you're a fool, and you should just fire that fucking crossbow. Jaime said, his voice angry, though not at Bronn. Tyrion noticed. Which is why I'm fucking here. Your sister was dead the moment those dragons arrived, and any fucking hope she had of winning went out the door. After that mad fucker jumped from the dragon's back. So, where does that leave me? An offer to a castle that right now is worthless, or another lie from two cunts who I've spent years wiping their arses for, and to no reward. You're Sarah Braun of the Blackwater, Tyrion said, looking directly at him. That's worth about as much as a pile of that dragon shit outside Winterfell's walls. No, it's time old Bronn here took matters into his own fucking hands. Cersei will lose unless all of a sudden some of the Dragon Queen and the bastard's top men start falling, and to get my fucking castle, I'll make lots of you fucking fall. Bronn said, we made a deal long ago. Do you remember? If anyone paid me to kill you, then you'd give me double. What's double, Riverrun? Bronn asked. Highgarden, you could be Lord of the Reach. Tyrion said, though he wasn't sure how he'd pull it off. Still, Bronn being here gave him options he'd not had up to now. If Bronn was truly willing to kill for Riverrun, then what would he do for Highgarden? Jon Snow would beat the man in a straight-up fight, but Bronn didn't fight straight up, and unlike other kings, Jon was lax in his own protection. With him gone, Tyrion would be in a position not only to give Bronn Highgarden, but to see himself set too. He smiled when he thought that of all people who'd come to his aid, it was Cersei who'd perhaps giving him all he truly needed. Highgarden, are you mad? Jaime asked. Better than being dead, he replied. He's not going to kill us. He wouldn't be talking, Jaime said as the bolt flew from the crossbow and barely missed his head. Way I see it, I only need of the Lannister brothers alive. Bronn said as Jaime glared at him, Highgarden will never belong to a cutthroat, the Reach won't stand for it, and neither will the king or queen. Jaime said, no, who are your ancestors? The ones who made your family rich, cutthroats, thieves, killers, and vagabonds. You may have risen high, you golden cunt, but your house, like mine, started very fucking low, Bronn said. Aye, they did, Tyrion said to a glare from Jaime. Highgarden, give me your word, Bronn said. You have my word, Tyrion answered, but none of this means anything until we take King's Landing. We could use the help of the former commander of the City Watch, Tyrion said. Oh no, my fighting days are done, but I still got a few killing days left. You hear me? Bronn said as he got up and began to back away. He didn't see it, never heard it. How it managed to not just get into the tavern, but to sneak up so completely on a man who prided himself on knowing where and when there was a threat to his life. Tyrion couldn't tell. Bronn barely had a chance to reach out and open the door. The arm with the crossbow was ripped off so quickly and so silently. Other than the screams from Bronn himself, there was no sound, and Tyrion almost pissed himself. The screams didn't last too long either, as in the blink of an eye, Ghost had torn Bronn's throat out. The sounds of the last gurgles of Bronn's breath and the pooling of the blood along with the crackling of the logs in the fire were the only noises in the tavern. Even as the great white wolf moved towards them, its red eyes staring deep into his own, and its snout covered in Bronn's blood, not a sound could be heard. When Ghost reached the table, he felt sure it was the end, and he felt a few stray drops of piss roll down his leg. To say he was relieved when the wolf turned to Jaime and when it licked his brother's hand wouldn't do justice to how he felt. Tyrion looking on as the white wolf behaved like some gray puppy, as his brother fed it some of the meat from the table. On the floor, almost right at the door, Bronn had stopped moving. His lifeblood was pooled all around him, and Tyrion reached for his mug and emptied it in one swallow. All the while, Jaime fed Ghost pieces of meat, and the white wolf's red eyes just stared at him as if it was giving him a silent warning. Be wary, those eyes said. Be wary because you've just seen what happens to those who are not. It was a warning that he intended to take very much to heart. Winterfell 305 AC. Dany. There was something on Aegon's mind that for now at least he wasn't sharing with her. That it was all he wasn't sharing did at least make her believe that whatever it was, he would tell her when the time was right. After the feast, they'd come back to their room, they'd lain together and spoken of the future. Aegon had surprised her when he got up and walked to the chest he kept the dragon egg in, and when he then brought it over to her. Do you feel it? He asked as he handed it to her. Dainty, feeling the dragon moving inside. The egg even warmer now than it had been. It's more alive, she asked. I know now why I have that egg, Aegon said. Because your father wanted you to have it, she said, and he shook his head. It's for the babe, Daddy. The dragon in that egg is the babe's mount. Aegon said, and she looked to see he was smiling as he did so. How do you know? She asked. I feel it, Dany. It calls when you're in the room. The egg, it was never alive for me. It was always for the babe. Aegon said as Dany moved the egg closer to her stomach. She felt it then. The dragon inside her and the one in the egg almost seemed to be moving towards each other. She was telling Missandei this as her friend fixed her hair, then chuckling at the frown on her face. When she had seen her own efforts at the elaborate braids that Missandei was so adept at. This more than anything she had missed when her friend was on the road. Their time spent together as Missandei fixed up her hair was never about that alone. It was about them sharing their concerns, speaking of their hopes and dreams, and for Dainty that even more than the good advice she gave was why she loved her friend so. There was no one apart from Aegon now that she could share her thoughts with so completely, and with Missandei there were things she could share with her that she couldn't even with her husband. They spoke of her time on the road, Dany listening as Missandei told her of how Ghost saved her life and how he protected and fed her while they traveled south and then back north. She laughed freely when Missandei said that not only had the White Wolf being her protector, but he'd been her blanket too, its soft white fur keeping her far warmer than any fire. When she spoke of Tyrion and Sandy felt her anger rise, more at the latter than the former. They'd given her every chance and would now be forced to deal with her once and for all. Dany worrying just how Aegon would take it when they finally did so. There, all done, my queen, Missandei said, and Dany looked into the looking glass, finally looking just how she had when she had arrived here all those moons ago. Shall we take a walk? She asked, and Missandei nodded, both of them leaving the room and strolling through the keep. This was yet another thing she had missed. The simplicity of walking with her friend, almost as if they were just two friends, and she was not a queen with a kingdom to conquer and enemies to deal with. She tried doing the same with Aegon and had found him to be far less good company than her friend was, only his sister Arya coming close to offering her the same feeling as her walks with Missandei did. Is that his grace? Missandei said, and Dany looked to see Aegon readying to face Ned Dane in a spar, a crowd of Northmen, free folk, Unsullied, and Dothraki, along with the Dornish all gathering to watch. It seems my husband wishes to put on a show. Should I give him some encouragement? She asked, feeling a little wicked. I think he'd most enjoy that your grace, Missandei said with a smirk. A gold dragon on Lord Dane, she called out, and giggled when Aegon's head turned so fast towards her that she thought he'd snap his neck. Mine own wife, you wound me so, my love. Aegon said, feigning hurt only to smile and tease her back. Though I find myself most in need of a gold dragon, and so I'll take that wager. She turned to Missandei and leaned in close, asking her to send for a gold dragon, and both of them almost falling into a fit of giggles as she did so. The crowd that now gathered for the spar was even larger, and Dany noticed Ned Dane's cousin to be looking at her far more intently than he was at the spar that was about to begin. He'd flirted and came very close to crossing the line at the feast. Dany, though, had enjoyed her husband's jealousy too much to set him straight, but given how he looked at her and what she'd just done, she worried that he may get the wrong idea. It was something she'd address at a later time, she thought, as the spar began. Dany was not someone who truly understood swords. She did, though, appreciate the men who wielded them greatly, and she could tell an impressive blade from one that was not. Sor Aimee and Lady Brienne both carried Valyrian steel, as did Jorah, now also, thanks to Aegon and her husband's own blade. Longclaw was dark and impressive. She had to admit to herself, though, that none of them came close to the beauty of Dawn, its milky white blade shining brightly as it reflected the sun. She knew that she was not alone in giving it an admiring glance or two, and even Aegon himself had seemed awed by it. Not that it took his focus from the fight in front of him, Dany watching eagerly as the two blades clashed together and the sound reverberated around the courtyard. The sound itself was otherworldly, Dany hearing it almost as if it was a musical note being played by a really well-made instrument, and she found she quite enjoyed the song it sung, almost as much as she enjoyed the way her husband moved. Aegon was lithe and graceful, and while Dany was no slouch and quite accomplished, her husband danced as he too heard the song. "He's very good," she heard Sarah say as he walked up behind her and Missandei. "He is the sword of the morning, Sarah, just as his uncle was before him," Dane said, knowing it was Ned Dane he was speaking of, and not Aegon. "I saw Sir Arthur fight once, just in a spar like this, but he was an artist. I've only ever seen two men come anywhere close, and only one who could have matched him," Jorah said. "Sir Barristan was one, who was the other." "Sir Jorah?" Missandei asked, and Dany smiled a sad smile, thinking on her fallen knight. "His Grace," Jorah said, motioning to Aegon. The thoughts that had threatened to go down a slightly dark road at the mention of Barristan now traveled down a much different one. Dany looking on as Aegon danced away from Dawn's blade, and as the Northmen, free folk, the Unsullied, and Dothraki all cheered their king on, while not playing with him. Ned was too good for that, she suspected. Aegon was fighting within himself. Dany had seen his true skill when he faced the Night King. Here he was laying traps, spinning away from Ned's attacks and parrying his blows. He was feinting and not truly attacking. And then, all of a sudden, he was. "It's over," Jorah said. Dany watched as Longclaw began to move ever faster, as Aegon pushed forward and Ned Dane struggled to keep him at bay. The two blades were barely seen, so fast were they moving, one pressing the attack and the other fighting desperately to stave it off. It was a futile effort as she heard the loud cheers when Dawn was knocked to the ground, and Aegon held the tip of Longclaw's blade no more than an inch from Ned's neck. "I yield, your grace," Ned said with a beaming smile as he again took Longclaw away and bent down to pick Dawn up and hand it back to its owner. "You must forgive me, Lord Dane, but being from the north, I know the value of coin, and a gold dragon is a gold dragon." Agag said to loud laughs as he slapped Ned warmly on the back. Dany looked to Missandei and nodded as the girl handed her the coin. She then leaned forward and held it up for all to see. "To the victor go the spoils," she said as she threw it in the air. The coin flipped over and over as it fell, and she soon found herself laughing as Arya Stark raced forward and caught it. Again looking to his sister, who had a mischievous grin on her face as she ran. Her husband looking anything but a king as he chased after her to more laughs. It was good to see it, she thought, both from Aegon and Arya, but also from the rest of those who'd fought the dead. They deserved to be happy and to have moments like this. Given what they'd gone through, they deserved it far more than most. She and Missandei continued on their walk, Dany speaking to women and children. Sarah Jorah, Grey Worm, and Kano soon joining them and speaking on the spar. By the time she made it back to her room, it was almost nightfall. She'd been so caught up in listening to children and visiting with mothers with young ones, especially that she'd lost track of time, watching mothers feed their babes at their breast as she spoke to them, stirring up far different feelings than the sight once had. After Rhaego, she'd only felt sad when she saw such a sight. The knowledge that they were doing what she could not cut her deep. Now she felt excitement, eagerness, and hope. The knowledge that she'd soon be doing the same only filled her with increasing joy. Dany soon expressing that joy as she stood in front of the looking glass and thought of the babe that grew inside of her. To King's Landing 305 AC. Cersei. He was accomplished far more so than she had imagined, and his mind was as devious and cruel as her own. The things he'd promised her he'd do to the dragon bitch, to the wolf whore, the bastard, and the brother who'd abandoned her, made her wet. What he promised to do to the imp actually was enough to make her come. The thoughts of Tyrion falling into Euron's hands made her have no need of her own or anyone else's. Cersei actually feeling herself come the first time he told her, and surprisingly the second and third too. It made her think she was wrong to have Qyburn send Bronn to kill them both, though she would take satisfaction in hearing that Tyrion was dead. Knowing Aemma would be interesting to see how she actually reacted, and was in truth the only reason she'd asked for it to be done. She needed to know if she could feel sadness or what regret tasted like. She needed to know if she could feel anything but hate anymore. So even if it cost her Yaemma, her other half who'd left her all alone, she'd pay the price to find out who she was now. She walked to the window and looked down at the city. Her city, hers. Not Sansa Stark's, not her bastard brothers, and certainly not that dragon spawn. Younger and more beautiful, neither of them would be either by the time Euron was finished with them. After looking around and not finding any wine, she called for the servant, who then quickly set off to right that wrong. The girl who'd cut her hair to resemble her was one of the few that she had any time for, and one who'd warmed her bed more than once. Cersei finally finding someone who knew the only reason why she'd care whether they had a tongue or not. Your Grace. She heard the soft voice and turned to see Qyburn had entered along with the girl, Cersei waving her off and pouring the wine herself as her hand took a seat when bid. What is it? She asked. Word from the north, Your Grace, Qyburn said as she bid him continue. The army of the dead has been defeated. See, I told you this was naught but a distraction. Send my men north, as if I'd do such a foolish thing. What losses did they suffer? A dragon, perhaps. The cockless heathens or the savages? Minimal, Your Grace, Qyburn said as she glowered at him. Minimal. Are you telling me their armies are nearly intact? She almost screamed. They are, Your Grace, Qyburn said. Gron? Should be there by now, Your Grace. What other news, my brother? She asked, feeling worried over Jamesy now. Survived, as did the imp, Qyburn replied. The wolf whore? She asked, hoping that at least one of them had suffered. Sansa Stark wasn't in Winterfell, Your Grace. She's traveled to the Vale. She felt her chest tighten. The girl's cousin ruled the Vale, and they'd not fought on any side if she could bring them to bear. No, that it would matter. She supposed extra numbers wouldn't be what won the next war. No, if it came down to numbers alone, then she was already done for. But she was her father's daughter, and she'd learned at his hands. Numbers don't win wars, leaders win wars, and she was born to lead. We have people in the Vale? She asked, and Qyburn nodded. See it done, bloody, if possible, but as long as the wolf horde dies, I care not. Of course, Your Grace, there is something else. A strange letter from Dorne. Qyburn said, handing it to her. She opened it, read it, and reread it, the words not making any sense to her, or to be more truthful, not very much sense. Of the night, the star that burns brightest is not the one you see, but the one you do not. What is this? Some kind of jest? I believe it's from Sergeral Dane, Your Grace. He refers to himself as the Dark Star. A play on House Dane, Qyburn said. And how would he be in a position to see this done? She asked curiously. He and his cousin, along with a party from Dorne, sailed to White Harbor, Your Grace, as I told you a number of weeks ago. Qyburn said, and she waved him off, and bid him continue. I believe he would see it done, Your Grace. Were we willing to match his price? Dorne, she said with a sneer. We need someone there. We can rely on Your Grace, Princess Arianne. Is not that person. Her brother may very well be, and Sergeral claims that Prince Quentyn will soon arrive with men to see Dorne is taken. Qyburn said, with our help, she said, shaking her head. He does ask for the Iron Fleet and the Golden Company in return, does he not? He also promises to deliver us Jon Snow and Daenerys Targaryen, or the key to their downfall. Qyburn said, very well. Make the deal. We can always change the terms later, she said with a smile, as Qyburn nodded. She drank her wine as her hands set off to see her will was done. Cersei smiling broadly, and then even more so when she heard his footsteps behind her. His hand dipped straight between her legs, and she knew he'd find her wet and ready for him. Lately, she always was. Some of it was the man himself, the words he spoke, and the promises he made. But most of it was the fact she was a queen, a true queen, and soon she'd stand and watch as all her enemies fell before her eyes. Cersei closed her eyes as she came on his fingers, the image of King's Landing covered in green flames playing out in her head. Burn them all, the voice in her mind called out. Burn them all. Winterfell 305 AC. Aegon. He'd enjoyed the spar and the chase with Arya, Aegon finding himself walking with his sister down into the crypts, the two of them alone, and Arya leaned close against him when they reached the statues. While she stood silently in front of her father's, he moved to his mother's, almost expecting to hear her voice once more. The silence was welcome, though, and he told her that he understood and that he wouldn't waste the second chance he'd been given. When will you march? Yarya asked, taking him from his thoughts. Within the week, he said, and Winterfell. Will need its lady, he said, looking to her and seeing her shake her head. No, that's not me. That's not who I want to be. Please, Jon, don't. Please, she said, moving to him. I'd not name you against your will, and I won't ever ask you to be what you're not, or you know me better than that, he said, and saw the relief on her eyes. I thought you were going to say, but, she said, making them both laugh. No, I'll not say that. What I will is this. All your life you didn't want to be a lady because of how you thought a lady was supposed to be. How she had no say in her life, no right to make decisions without her husband's approval. No power but that given to her by her position and her marriage. There are other ladies too. Arya, Lady Meiji. Lyanna Mormont. Do you see any making their choices for them? He asked, and she shook her head. No. No. People I've spoken to, people who knew my mother told me that she was very much like you. She was wild, free, and refused to accept the choices that others made for her. Our grandfather and her brothers, all of them other than Uncle Benjen, failed her Arya. They tried to make her do what she didn't want to, and because of that, I swear I'll not fail you. But were it to be something you wish for, then I'd name you Lady of Winterfell and Wardness of the North. You'd be the most powerful person in the entire North, and i.e., while there would be responsibilities, and like any of us at times, you'd have to, well, you may not enjoy. No one would tell you who to be. Or, yeah, no one but you, he said, mussing her hair, and getting a slap in return. I don't want it, Jon. I want to go with you and Dany when you go south. I want to see you crowned. After that I don't know, but I don't want to be a lady, Jon. Not even that kind, she said softly. He grabbed her in his arms and kissed her forehead and then hugged her tight, feeling her arms go around his back and her head lean closer to his chest. A part of him knew she'd never accept, and it left him in a quandary. For now, he could name a Castellan, and they could name a different warden. But there must always be a Stark in Winterfell, and it would seem that they had run out of Starks, Aegon knowing there was no way he'd ever name the only other one to the seat. Leaving the crypts, he saw Tyrion and Jaime walk in through the gates, and that ghost was walking alongside them. The look on both men's faces, letting him know that the wolf had done as he'd asked. Aegon held his hand out, and Ghost raced towards him. The blood on his snout, all the evidence that was required to show that Bronn was now dead. Nodding to Arya, he moved toward Jaime and Tyrion, hating what he was about to do, but knowing the need for it, and glad that Jaime had agreed with him. They needed him close enough so that he had the opportunity to betray them, and so they could manage that betrayal. Again was certain now what form that betrayal would take. After all, he'd had years to think about events and play them out in his head. Sansa's betrayal was of him, the secret he'd told her, and she'd sworn to uphold the form of that betrayal. Tyrion's was far more devious. He'd cost Dany far more than any other, and he'd try to do so once more, though this time Rosieg, old Missandei, and his queen would not suffer at the hands of the imp. Busy day, he said, with a smile, as Jaime and Tyrion looked at him. Did you send your wolf, your grace? Tyrion asked. Send him, Lord Tyrion? He asked, confused. My brother and I were sharing a drink in the tavern in Wintertown. Your grace. We were set upon by a man we both trusted, Sir Bronn of the Blackwater, and were it not for Ghost. Jaime said, though it was clear Tyrion didn't agree with his brother's assessment by the look on his face, Ghost can be a law unto himself. Sarkhaneh, while I have some control over him, he knows far better than me where danger lurks. Don't you, boy? He said, rubbing the wolf's head. Well, we're most grateful for his help, your grace, Tyrion said, sounding anything but. I'll be sure to reward him suitably, he said before he looked to Ser Jaime and then to Tyrion. Perhaps we can speak later. Lord Tyrion will soon be making our plans to march south, and I'm sure her grace and I will welcome your thoughts. I'll be more than happy to help any way I can, your grace, Tyrion said, smiling. Ser Jaime, perhaps you'd care to join me, he said, turning to walk away. Tyrion hurrying off into the keep and almost skipping as he did so. He walked to the smithies and saw her as soon as he got there. Brienne, speaking to the Hound and to Arya, who'd unsurprisingly to him, rushed straight here after they'd spoken. His sister would discuss the offer with Gendry, and so perhaps all was not yet lost in that regard. Though the idea of having her with him was one he found most appealing should she not change her mind. Your Grace, Brienne said, and Aegon tried to put her at ease. Something the Hound was very much already at, the man standing there eating from a plate of chicken and with a large jug of ale on the barrel beside him. Sir Brienne, I was wondering if Sir Jaime and I may have a word. Of course, your grace, she said, moving towards them both immediately. Perhaps the Godswood would be best, he said, and she nodded. That all right, no need to say hello, Iori said, smirking at him, and then laughing when he stuck his tongue out at her. Aegon, Jaime, Ghost, and Brienne all left the smithy with smiles on their faces, and to the sounds of Arya's laughter. They walked silently into the Godswood, Aegon, sure that Brienne was asking Jaime what this was about, and he wondered if the knight himself even knew what he was about to ask. He guessed that he might, and given the smile that was still on his face when they reached the Weirwood, it seemed he very much approved. We in the north have a special connection to the Weirwood, Sir Brienne. We use them to speak to our gods and we believe they see us through them, he said as he reached out to touch the tree. I've heard it spoken of your grace, she said. It's said that an oath sworn in front of a weirwood can't be broken on the pain of death, and should a lie be told in front of one, the old gods would know and curse the man or woman who spoke it. A strange thing I've always thought. Oaths should never be broken, and lies, well, some lies are necessary, he said, trailing off, lost in thought for a few moments. Your grace? Jaime asked, when he didn't speak for some time. Forgive me, sirs, I don't know whether it's ghosts of the past or simply the memories of it that make me lose myself here, he said as he shook his head. You hold true to oaths, do you not, TARGERIYAN? He asked. I try to, your grace, she said. My wife and I are in need of those who do, of those who can be trusted to hold to the oaths they swear. It means more to us both than any skill with a blade or prowess on the field, though possessing both doesn't hurt either, he said with a small laugh. He could see that Jaime, if he'd not known what he was planning, certainly did now, though Brienne was still a little lost. My wife intends to break the wheel, figuratively at least. Westeros is not yet ready for it to be broken completely, and so I've convinced her to add more spokes to it, to make changes that in time will lead to more changes. One of those changes brings me to why I've asked to speak to you today. Sayer Brienne of Tarth, in my own name and in the name of my wife, I would like to extend to you the offer of a place on our royal guard, King's Guard or Queen's Guard. It matters not, as both are equal, and so is the same with knights, he said, and heard her gasp. Your grace, I'm not worthy of such an honor, she said, dropping to her knee. My wife believes you are, as do I, and as does Sir Jaime. Take some time to think on it, and let us both know, on the morrow, he said, moving to touch her shoulder. He left her and Jaime by the weirwood and then walked from the Godswood with Ghost and was soon walking into the keep, nodding to Ned Dane and to his cousin, who both looked his way as he did so. As he walked through the corridors, he saw Grey Worm and Missandei hurrying to the former's room, eager to get reacquainted, no doubt, and he smiled as he remembered Dany telling him that just like he did with her, they too did many things together. Reaching his door, the unsullied guards opened it for him and he stepped inside. Ghost going to the fire to lay down in front of it while he looked for his wife. Aegon finding her standing in front of the looking-glass with a beaming smile on her face, and so he moved up behind her. My wife smiles so, yet I'm not here. What pleases her, and should I be jealous that it's not, Aegon said, kissing her neck as he stood behind her. Perhaps you should act, for I find there may be someone whom I love even more than you, she said, smiling still as she took his hand and placed it on her belly, the swelling having grown just a little more in the past few days. On this, I can find no fault in my wife's choice, and no jealousy in my eyes or my heart. Only love, full and unconditional, only love, little dragon, Aegon said as knelt down and placed a kiss on her stomach. Winterfell, 3005 AC. Oh, Jon. He sat at his desk looking over the figures. Their losses had been so much less than he had even dared to hope for. Last time they'd been devastated, the Unsullied had lost more than half their number, as had the Dothraki, and of those who'd survived and been fit to fight it, it was less than half. Yet again, both dragons had taken injuries, and Rhaegal wasn't truly fit to fly, and as for the Northern Army and the Free Folk, they'd almost been wiped out. They also suffered losses that were even harder to take than sheer numbers alone, losses that were more personally devastating to both him and to Dany. Ed and Lyanna Mormate's losses had hurt him terribly, and considering he wasn't in the best frame of mind in the first place, they had taken time to truly hit home. Jaime had lost Sarah Jard, and he supposed him too. For all the good he'd done, the woman he loves and had claimed to then, worse was to come. But the Dany who'd left Winterfell was already a lesser woman than the one who'd arrived. She'd been hurt, ignored, abandoned, and soon enough she was to be left almost completely alone. This time it was very much different. The Dothraki had lost less than 4,000, with another 1,000 or so injured. The Unsullied a little less than 1,000. Of those inside the keep, they'd lost 300 Northmen and twice that in Free Folk. Ned Dane had lost only 4 men. Other than the Knights of the Vale, who'd lost almost 3/4 of their number, a little over 400 uninjured men and 100 who'd most likely never fight again would be returning to the Vale. They'd been damnable lucky. As for the losses of people, Lord Jon Royce was no friend of his, and so Aegon wouldn't mourn him. Beric Podrick Howland Reed he would to different degrees. Rubbing his eyes, he looked down at the numbers, and the plan began to form in his head. You didn't wake me? Dany said, walking into the room. Aegon gladly accepting the kiss she gave him and moving his chair so that she could sit on his lap. "For this?" he asked with a chuckle and pointing to the page with the numbers written upon it. "For this, I think you having a long lie-in was very much merited," he said as she took the page from the table. "Is that our strength?" she asked, looking at the number he'd written near the bottom of the page. "Aye, both the Unsullied and Dothraki are in much better shape than we could have hoped for. The losses, though regretful, aren't devastating," he said. And she nodded. "What's this number?" she asked, pointing to the number he'd written to the side. "Northmen I intend to bring with us," Aegon said. "So few?" she asked, shaking her head. "If what Ned Dane says is true, then we will be joined by Dornish spears. Had the losses been greater than I'd seek to bring more, but 2,000 is more than enough. All we need is confirmation that the North rides with us, not the men themselves, and the rest would be best served to prepare the North. Winter is coming," he said as she giggled. "Those really are your words," she said, laughing still. "No, my love, that's just the fact of life in the North. My words are the same as yours," he said, kissing her deeply. They kissed for some time before the knock came to the door. Aegon bidding whoever it was to enter, and relieved when it was Miss Ande who did so. He saw the smile she gave Dane and heard her mention breaking their fast. Dane surprising him when she said she'd do so in the great hall today. Kissing him once more, his wife got up from his lap and made her way into the other room to dress for the day. Aegon looking down on the paper once more and taking the quill in his hand. Winterfell. The North. Tyrion. Sansa. He wrote the 4 words out and sat looking at them for a few moments, each of them problems that needed to be handled. Arya's reluctance to be the Lady of Winterfell left him in a bind. Well, he had his own issues with that side of his family. He did agree there should always be a Stark in Winterfell. Now, not only would there not be when they traveled south, but there also may not ever be one again. That the North itself wasn't ready for winter and would need to be made so and made so quickly was another problem. Again staring at the paper before he nodded as he came up with plans for Winterfell and the North that he hoped were the right ones. Tyrion was another matter. Aegon hadn't been there when Rhaegal died and Missandei was taken only for the aftermath of it. He'd seen Dany broken almost beyond repair, and despite being the one person who may have been able to bring her back to herself, he'd mutely stood by and let her fall the rest of the way. But over the years he'd wondered how Euron had known that was how she would travel. No one was that lucky, and as far as he knew, Euron wasn't a warg, so how had he known that they'd sail back to Dragonstone? He'd waited in the perfect place for an ambush, Davis showing him the cove as he sailed to Dragonstone himself. But it was only perfect if you knew that Dragonstone was the destination. Even going to Dragonstone itself was a damn dumb idea, and it was for that reason that he'd ruled out Sansa as the one who told Euron that was the plan. Not only had it been Tyrion's idea for Dany to go back to the island, but it had been also his to split their forces and for Aegon to march with the Northern Army rather than join them. Aegon had been so wrapped up in his own head that he'd not thought to argue, and he had also perhaps wished to be away from Dany too. He realized now to his shame. He planned it, Aegon said, running a line through Tyrion's name. He planned it, and so I'll let him do so again. He was certain of it now, just as he was that Tyrion had ensured that Dany lost Dorne and the Iron Fleet. Not because of incompetence, but malice. The Reach was lost because of hubris. Tyrion thinking himself far more clever than he was, but Dorne had been deliberate. Tyrion sought payback for a niece while weakening Dany at the same time. Yrden had been all about making Dany even weaker than she was. Weak, alone, and in need of Tyrion even more. Not only did he wish to be the man in his wife's bed, but Tyrion also wanted to be the only power behind the throne as well. Aegon would give him the opportunities to think that he had a chance to achieve both this time around, and he would make sure he never came close to either. Looking at the last word on the page, he ran his fingers over her name. The girl he'd once thought a sister and had felt great sympathy for. No one had played him as well as she had. Sansa hitting all the points to make him worry far more for her than he did even for the woman he loved. She'd played the family card, the damsel in distress card, the need of a protective older brother card, and Jon Snow had fallen for each and every one of them. Aegon Targaryen would not. She was not his kin, not his blood, and her game was far less complex than she thought it was. He closed his eyes and found himself standing on the docks and saying goodbye to what he had thought was his family. Arya barely recognizable, Bran playing what he thought was a clever wordplay jape, and Sansa is still playing her game. Can you forgive me? The last words she had ever spoken to him, even then at the end it had not been about him, only her, and now, finally, he could see it all so clearly. No, Sansa, I cannot, he said as he held the paper to the candle and watched it burn. Sansa's name, the last of it, to go up in flames. Volantis 305 AC. The Frog Prince, the blood from his sword dripped onto the ground, and he looked at the body that lay in front of him. She'd been a beautiful woman once, he supposed, but now she was anything but. Quentyn turned from the room and walked down the long corridor, smiling as he listened to the carnage around him. He'd expected far more resistance. The fiery hand was supposed to be as resolute as the Unsullied, and yet he'd found no sign of them or of the High Priestess. Everyone else they did find was put to the sword, Quentyn and his men reveling in the bloodletting, as did his benefactor, who finally showed his face as soon as he knew there was no danger to him. "Ah, my prince, I see you've been busy," Bellico said. "Not busy enough that priestess cunt got away. Kinvara is not here, nor are the fiery hand, as you said, both would be," Quentyn said. "That is most odd. Perhaps her god gave her eyes the others did not have." Bellico said, with a chuckle. "Perhaps, come we do have some left alive. Benaraer and Makoro were here, and Sarah Archibald and Sarah Jairus are no doubt keen to begin their fun." Quentyn said with a chuckle of his own. He walked down and into the large open hall of the Red Temple. Near the altar, the two Red Priests were bound and gagged among a sea of bodies. Young, old, worshippers and acolytes. The windblown had shown no mercy and given no quarter. Well, except to these two, and that was only a temporary reprieve. Quentyn looked to Bellico, who seemed more than happy at the sight in front of him. Nodding to Jairus, Makaro's gag was removed, and Bellico moved closer to the black flame. "Where is she?" Bellico asked to no answer. "He asked you where she is," Quentyn said, nodding to Archibald, who pushed the man down to the ground and swung his hammer, the scream reverberating around the room as the Makaro's hand was crushed. "Must I ask again?" Bellico asked, and Quentyn was pleased to see that the answer was yes. For the next hour, Archibald swung his hammer, hands, feet, arms, legs, and finally, he slammed it down with all of his might on the back of Mokora's skull. Bellico and Quentyn both splattered by blood and brains as the man's head was crushed. Perhaps this one will be more forthcoming. Bellico said as Benaro's gag was removed. In one aspect he was. Benaro was far more willing to speak. Unfortunately, the words he spoke only enraged Bellico and Quentyn himself. Tales of fire and blood, of dragons burning them away until they were nothing. Benaro spoke of a fiery sword wielded by a prince that was promised, and that when death finally came to them both, they'd welcome it with open arms. "Where is she, Benaro?" Bellico asked, annoyed. "Gone to them," Benaro said as he began to laugh loudly. Quentyn gave the nod to Archibald, but then he, Bellico, Jairus, and Archibald were all forced to move quickly away from the Red Priest. The flames that covered Benaro threatening to cover any of them who strayed too close to the man. He looked on in shock as Benaro continued to laugh as the flames took him, the man's words now suddenly feeling that much more ominous as he watched him burn. Even Bellico looked a little nervous, and since he'd met the man, he'd been anything but. Quentyn glad when he was given the word to leave the Red Temple alongside his benefactor. That the slaves in the street didn't immediately attack them was only a further sign of the grip on the city Bellico and the other Triarchs now had. Even the occasional cries of Missa or the words that had appeared painted on walls were now a distant memory. He joined Bellico in his palanquin, and they were brought back behind the black walls. Quentyn certain that Jairus and Archibald would ensure that the Windblown celebrated accordingly. When they reached Bellico's manse, he was unsurprised to see Mallico, Melgair, and Niassos Visasar waiting for them. The fat Niassos looking nervous, while Mallico looked as confident as ever, Quentyn once again amazed by the difference between tigers and elephants. "It is done?" Mallico asked. "It is," Bellico replied simply, Quentyn noticing how the man left out Kinvara's escape. After practically being dismissed, Quentyn made his way to his room, eager for the warm bath and even warmer women that would be waiting. He'd been a maid when he came to Essos, and while his partners had always been unwilling in some shape or form since he got here, there had been numerous of them. Slaves, whores, and those unlucky enough to fall under the windblown's blades. He'd tasted them all since he'd taken both the tattered prince's head and his company from him. He reached his room and stripped from his clothes, putting on the robe before walking the few feet to the baths. Happy to see the two slaves already in the water waiting for him. Quentyn was soon floating in the water, the girls having washed him from head to toe, and the younger one had serviced him with her mouth. In his hand he held a glass of the finest wine, and he almost chuckled at his good fortune. His time in Essos had known great hardship and danger, but also great joy and rewards, and the last year had been the very best of it. That he would be soon leaving it, it was both something that he very much looked forward to, and something he wished was not the case. His memories of Dorne not ones he thought on with any great fondness, and yet he was its prince, and it was far better to rule than be ruled. "Triarch Bellico wishes to see you, my prince," the tall man said, and Quentyn nodded as he finished his wine. He left the baths, dressed, and made his way quickly to the Triarch's rooms. The man was not someone you kept waiting, even if you had a sellsword company at your side. Entering the rooms, he was happy to see Bellico was alone. Nyaxos was a blubbering fool, and Malako, despite the fact they were both men of the sword, had no real liking for him. Though the man hated all Westerosi equally ever since news of his daughter's death had reached him. "You wish to see me?" he said, taking the offered seat. "I do, Kinvara, Prince Quentyn. She is a problem," Bellico said. "She is one woman, Bellico," he replied with a shake of his head. "One woman, with the fiery hand." "Quentyn, why do you think I was so eager for her demise?" Bellico asked. "Because the Red Priests were the only ones who would dare call you out over your plans regarding Daenerys Targaryen," he said, seeing Bellico's expression change. "I care not for those who call me out, it's those who'd stand against me that give me pause," Bellico said. "A woman and some warrior priests," he said with a snort. "Who are now on their way to a woman with dragons," Bellico said. "My people have faced and beat dragons before," Quentyn said proudly. "Did they? Is that the only part of your history you remember, Prince Quentyn? Is the dragon's wrath not something that is taught in Dorne? You have scorpions and other weapons besides your black walls can withstand even a dragon's flames, can they not?" he asked. "I do, and they could, but what use is it to me if I'm forced to hide behind said walls? How do I see Essos righted if I'm stuck here in fear for my life? Do you really think I reached out to a small sellsword company to kill a few damn priests?" Bellico said, his anger rising. "I know why you reached out to me. I've set events in motion, have I not? I've even sent a man to get close enough to bring the dragons to heel." Quentyn said, his own anger rising just as much. "You place too much trust in one man, Quentyn. I place mine in many," Bellico said. He looked at Bellico, trying to figure out what he meant, only to realize that he wasn't going to be told. Instead, he watched as a piece of paper was taken from a drawer and handed to him. "What's this?" he asked. "My approval for your plan. Malako has gone to see the ships and the men. You leave within the moon," Bellico said. "You're giving me the army?" he asked, surprised. "Under Malako's command, Quentyn, our men won't follow you, but they will do as you bid. As long as they help me take Dorne back from my whore of a sister, I care not whose orders they follow," he said with a smile. "Malako has his own reasons to see Westeros suffer. Bring him the heads of the Starks, and he'll be even more loyal to you than he is me." The Litro japed, or at least Quentyn felt the man was japing. "And you?" he asked. "Will put Essos to rights, once I know the Dragon Queen won't be coming my way." "Meereen?" he asked, and saw Bellico smile even more broadly. "It's time the Bay of Dragons got a new name, don't you think?" It took them a little over a moon to make ready to sail, Quentyn looking awestruck at the armada that Malakakeo and Bellico had assembled. A little over 15,000 men made up the Tiger Army, slave soldiers, archers, charioteers, along with his 2,000 windblown and whatever forces they could call on in Dorne. He felt it was more than enough. Arianne wouldn't be expecting him, and even if she was, she'd not be able to stop him. And should the Dark Star do his job, then Daenerys and her dragons wouldn't be too much of an issue either. Bringing the Starks to heel for Malako was not something he cared about. If he could do so, then he would. A loyal man was a good friend to have, but for him, it was not one that was needed. He only hoped the man could contain his bloodlust for those he blamed for his daughter's death. At least until Dorne was his. As long as he did that, then he could traipse all over Westeros, killing wolves and lions to his heart's content. Quentyn looked back at Bellico as the ship set sail, The look the man gave him in return was one that promised only one thing. Failure was not an option, and should he not manage to bring him Daenerys Targaryen, then he had better hope she got to Bellico before Bellico got to him. Home. Archibald said, slapping him on the back as the ship sailed from the bay. Dorne is sour, Jairus said, joining him. My father's seat, Quentin said as the three men turned and walked to their cabin. Winterfell 305 AC. Dany, after Missandei fixed her hair and she dragged her husband away from his numbers and plans, all three of them made their way to the Great Hall to break their fast. She enjoyed the mornings that she and Aegon go to spend together, and eating alone with him had its own benefits, but since Cynthia Stark had left, the atmosphere around Winterfell had changed. The arrival of the mountain clans, the acknowledgement of the Northern Lords that she was their queen, and the battle itself, all combining to make how she was viewed very much different from how it had been. In turn, this made her morning and evening meals so much more enjoyable. Dany able to join in with the banter just as she did with her own people, as the Northmen now seemed to see themselves as hers also. As they were walking, Sir Jaime approached with Sir Brienne, the Lady Knight, looking to her and to Aegon before she began to speak. Your Grace, I would like to most graciously accept your offer, Brienne said, and Dane saw Sir Jaime's smile. We are most pleased by this, Sir Brienne, most pleased, perhaps, after we've eaten, we can swear you in, she said, looking to Aegon, who nodded. Of course, Your Grace, Brienne said with a nod. Have either of you eaten? Aegon asked, and Sakano Figie, and then Brienne shook their heads. Then perhaps you'll join Her Grace, Missandei, and I would like that, Your Grace. Jaime said, and Dany smiled at the man as he and Brienne joined them on their walk. Reaching the Great Hall, they were quickly joined by Arya and Ghost, Aegon bidding the former Lord Commander of the Night's Watch to their table too. Dany found her appetite to be lesser this morning, Aegon leaning in to ask her if she was feeling well, and she giving him a small smile to show that she was. They were eating, and she found herself laughing as Aegon did his utmost to annoy his sister about her budding romance with the smith. Dany looking up to see the maester rushing their ways, carrying a raven scroll in his hands. Your Grace from the Riverlands, Wilken said, handing Aegon the scroll. She watched as Aegon broke the seal, her husband frowning when he saw the trout. Dangsier then looking on surprised as Aegon's expression soon changed into one that seemed far happier. Jon, she asked as he handed her the scroll. Your Grace? Missandei asked when her own expression matched her husband's. Lord Tully has named Jon as his king and says he's willing to swear oaths to such, she said, smiling, as she saw Aegon look at her. He's taken back the Riverlands, she heard a voice call out, and she looked to see Tyrion walking to their table. He and the Lords of the Trident say they intend to live up to the oaths sworn to my brother, and they intend to kneel to his heir, Aegon said. This is most excellent news, Your Grace, Tyrion said, surprising her. It is, she asked, rubbing Aegon's hand to let him know that it wasn't out of doubt. She was asking the question, but more because of who was speaking. It is. You're already Queen of the North by marriage and oath, and soon to be the same in the Riverlands. Dorne wishes to swear to you too. That's 3 of the 7 kingdoms that His Grace and Your Grace control before we've even marched, Tyrion said with a smile, and she found herself looking to see if it was genuine or not. Should we ask for some of their forces to join our own? She asked, turning to Aegon. We should, but perhaps we can finish eating first. Ergain said, smirking at her and then ducking when she went to slap him. Sir Ergain, Sir Brienne, ghosts protect your king, Ergain said when the next slap actually caught him. Dany laughed loudly as none of them moved, and Aegon shrugged his shoulders before muttering something about them liking her more than him. She bid Tyrion join them, and saw Aegon nod to her as he did so, his own wishes regarding Tyrion influencing her choices far more than the man himself. By the time they were done, the Northern Lords had joined them as well. Dany, seeing Tormund sitting with the Mormonts and Ser Jorah, began making his way to her, though she bid him eat with his family. After Aegon told the Northern Lords that they'd speak to them later, and she told Tyrion she'd welcome him at their meeting to discuss traveling south. She, Missandei, Sir Brienne, and Sir Jaime, along with Arya, headed to the Godswood. Brienne would not just be swearing an oath to join the Kingsguard, but would be soon privy to a secret that Dany wondered just how much longer could be kept. Her people knew, and Arya knew. Sir Jaime and Lord Varys knew. While she trusted them all, it was she felt only a matter of time until it outed. and perhaps it was for the best that they get in front of it now while they held so much goodwill. It was something she knew she would need to speak to Aegon about, and so she resolved to do so when she got a chance. For now, they had other things to do, and so when they reached the weirwood, Dany nodded to Aegon and she waited for him to tell Brienne the truth. "You're truly Prince Rhaegar's son?" Brienne asked as Aegon finished. The woman had already sworn not to reveal anything she was told, and Dany believing her to be true to her word, just as Aegon did. "I am. There are papers and things I found. Lord Reed also confirmed it to me when he arrived. He traveled with my uncle to Dorne and found my mother at the Tower of Joy," Orjing said. "Why not just tell the realm, Your Grace?" Brienne asked. "There are those in the realm who would use this against my wife, Sir Brienne. Those who would seek to use it for their own ends. We have 3 kingdoms based on my wife's name and mine own. Darn hasn't sworn to me yet, and when the truth outs of who I truly am, there are issues there that will need to be resolved. The North, I may believe, would kneel to me still. They certainly would to my wife," Aegon said, and she found herself smiling, knowing he was speaking the truth. "Or they may think differently, and the Riverlands have sworn to Jon Snow," Brienne said, as Iakin nodded. "Until Cersei is removed and my wife sits her throne, I believe it's safer that I remain Jon Snow. After that, we'll let people know." Myojian said, "You have my word, Your Grace. Nothing of this shall pass my lips without your leave," Brienne said. "I have no doubt of it, sir." "Surrey shared in why I, if you will," Aegon said, and she watched as Brienne took a knee and swore an oath. Aegon surprising her and them when he called Surrey Targaryen to the godswood, her bear bearing 3 pieces of white material in his hands. "Sir Shami," Yak said, taking one of them. Dany looked on as he put the first on Jaime's back and the second on Brienne's, before taking the third and bidding Sir Jorah kneel too. When he handed her the white cloak, she smiled at him before she placed it on her bear's back, Jorah looking up to her with a proud look on his face. "Arise, Sir Jaime Lannister, Sir Brienne Tarth, and Sir Jorah Mormont. Kingsguard, Queensguard, our outdated concepts. Arise now and be known as the Dragon Guard," Aegon said. Dany finally saw the outline of the 3-headed dragon that had been done in the same beads that Missandei had placed in her wedding dress, and she looked to her friend, who looked sheepishly back at her. "Lord Commander, I leave it to you to assign duties, and to all 3 of you to begin to look out for your further 4. Aegon said to Satyarja, and she nodded to her bear as the 3 of them walked away. She waited until they were gone, and she turned to Aegon, who was looking at her intently. Missandei speaking to Ara nervously as if she displeased her somehow. "When?" she asked her husband, moving closer to him. "I asked Missandei to make the 2 cloaks when she traveled south. The 3rd, after speaking to Brienne yesterday." "And Sir Jorah?" she asked. "You think I was only doing numbers this morn," Aegon said as she leaned against him. "Thank you for naming him, Lord Commander," she said softly. "He was your Queen's guard for years, my love. He protected you when I could not," Yaksan said as he kissed her, Dany chuckling when Racha made an annoyed sound. "Really? What's wrong, little sister? Jealous, wishing you were with a certain smith?" Aegon said before he was hiding behind her as Arya tried to hit him. "My brave husband," she said to laughs. They made their way back to the courtyard, Dany listening as Aegon told her that he was going to speak to the Northern Lords, and so she decided to join Missandei and Arya in the training yards. She was soon joined by Sir Jorah and Sir Brienne, and she looked to see Sir Jorah Synia following after Aegon. The Dragon Guard taking up their positions and their white cloaks, quickly garnering looks that they were approving ones, was a welcome thing. And when they reached the sparring area, she saw Sir Gerald facing a Northman. His cousin Ned walked her way as the man noticed her, and began to show off.